Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable, questions are allowed to wander a little, and science is invited to slow its pace just enough to let your thoughts rest. Tonight's journey is a gentle one, not because the idea is small, but because it's the kind of question that benefits from being held lightly rather than squeezed for answers. So take a breath, settle into whatever position feels easiest right now, and let the background noise of the day fade just a bit. There's a certain kind of question that has a way of arriving unannounced. It doesn't burst through the door or demand attention. Instead, it slips into your mind quietly, perhaps while you're staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep, or watching the glow of a screen dim as evening takes over. It sounds simple at first, almost playful, maybe even slightly absurd. And yet, once it's there, it tends to linger. What if humans are the experiment? Not in the dramatic sense that belongs in movies or late-night radio shows. Not in the way that suggests lab coats hovering behind mirrors or clipboards hidden in the clouds. But in a slower, subtler way. The kind of way that wouldn't announce itself at all. The kind that, if it were true, would feel less like a revelation and more like a quiet shift in perspective. The sort that makes familiar things look just a little different without changing their shape. After all, if you were running an experiment complex enough to involve an entire species, you probably wouldn't want the subjects to know. Awareness changes behaviour. Expectation alters outcomes. The moment you tell someone they're being observed, they start adjusting themselves, even if they don't mean to. So a truly long-term, large-scale experiment wouldn't come with labels or warnings. It would feel like life. Ordinary, unpredictable, sometimes confusing life. Before we wander too far into that idea, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from right now? Not the address, just the place as it feels to you. A bedroom at the end of a long day, a quiet kitchen with the lights turned low, a moving car, streetlights sliding past like slow, glowing thoughts. And what time is it where you are? Early evening, when the day hasn't quite let go yet, or deep night, when the world seems smaller and softer around the edges. There's something fitting about asking that, given the topic. A question about observation, asked from countless places, at countless moments, all happening at once without ever touching. If you find this kind of wondering soothing, or if it helps your mind ease out of its usual loops and settle into something slower, you're very welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this quiet corner reach other people who might be looking for the same kind of gentle curiosity. No pressure, of course. Consider it more of a polite nod than a request. Now let's ease into the idea itself, without rushing it or dressing it up. Humans are very good at assuming they are the point of things. It's not arrogance so much as habit. For most of our history, it made sense. You wake up, you eat, you work, you care for others, you try to make sense of what's around you. Your perspective is necessarily centered on yourself, then your family, then your group. Scale that up over generations, and it's easy to see how we came to believe that the universe must, in some way, be about us, or at least deeply concerned with us. Science complicated that story. Slowly at first, then all at once. Earth became one planet among many. Our sun turned into an average star. Our galaxy revealed itself as one among billions. Each discovery gently nudged humanity away from the center of the picture. And yet, even now, we often assume that intelligence, consciousness, and meaning must somehow revolve around us. We are still, in many ways, the default reference point. But experiments don't work that way. In a real experiment, the subjects are rarely the point. The point is the process, the reactions, the patterns that emerge over time, the unexpected behaviours that no one thought to predict. If humans were part of an experiment, the focus wouldn't necessarily be on our achievements or failures as individual people. It would be on how a self-aware species behaves when given certain conditions and left largely to its own devices. Consider the environment we find ourselves in. A planet with stable physical laws, a narrow temperature range that allows liquid water, chemistry complex enough to support life, and an energy source that arrives reliably every day without needing to be managed. Add to that a long stretch of relative stability punctuated by occasional disruptions, asteroid impacts, ice ages, volcanic winters, enough pressure to force adaptation, but not enough to wipe the slate clean too often. It's not proof of anything, of course, but it is a remarkably well-balanced setup for observing long-term biological and social development. Then there's the human brain, large enough to imagine futures that don't exist yet, flexible enough to invent tools, languages, stories, and moral systems, restless enough to question its own origins and purpose. If you are interested in studying how intelligence unfolds, how cooperation and conflict compete, how curiosity shapes survival, this would be a fascinating design, especially if you wanted to see what happens when the subjects start asking why they're here at all. What's interesting is how natural experimentation already feels to us. We run studies on animals, plants, and even each other, often with good intentions, sometimes with questionable ones. We set up conditions, change variables, observe outcomes. When ethical concerns arise, they usually focus on suffering or consent, not on the idea of experimentation itself. We accept, almost without thinking, that learning often involves watching how systems respond under pressure. That acceptance raises a quiet, uncomfortable mirror. If we're willing to experiment in order to understand, why assume we would never be experimented on? Not in a cruel or careless way necessarily, but in the same detached, curious way that scientists often approach complex systems, with patience, with notes taken over long stretches of time, with an understanding that individual outcomes matter less than overall trends. One of the reasons this idea feels unsettling is that it challenges our sense of agency. People like to believe they are fully in control of their lives, or at least that no larger framework exists beyond what we can see and measure. But control is already a slippery concept. We're shaped by biology we didn't choose, cultures we were born into, economic systems that predate us, and technologies that quietly reshape how we think. Even without any external observers, much of our behaviour is influenced by forces we rarely notice. And yet, within those constraints, choice still exists. People make decisions every day that aren't strictly predictable. They act against their own interests, or in favour of strangers, or in ways that surprise even themselves. If humans were part of an experiment, free will wouldn't necessarily be a flaw. It might be the main feature, a way to see what emerges when intelligence is allowed room to improvise. There's also the matter of time. Experiments involving humans as we run them tend to be short. Weeks, months, maybe years. But from a broader perspective, human civilization itself has unfolded over thousands of years, with biological roots stretching back much further. That kind of timeline would be impractical for us, but not for something operating on a different scale. From that vantage point, entire empires rising and falling could be comparable to shifts in data points, meaningful not because of their drama, but because of what they reveal about behaviour under changing conditions. Notice too how often humans test limits without fully understanding the consequences. We push technologies forward, alter ecosystems, reorganise societies, then watch to see what happens. Sometimes the results are beneficial, sometimes they're destabilising. Occasionally, they're irreversible. If you were observing this process from the outside, it would be difficult to tell whether it was reckless or instructive. Possibly both. There's a common assumption that an experiment implies a clear goal, a final answer waiting at the end. But many real experiments don't work that way. They evolve. Initial questions lead to new ones. Variables interact in unexpected ways. Sometimes the most important findings are the ones no one thought to look for. If humans are the experiment, it's entirely possible that there is no single outcome being measured, no pass or fail condition, just ongoing observation of what happens when awareness meets limitation. That perspective changes how certain experiences look. Conflict, for example, becomes less about good and evil and more about stress responses. Scarcity, perceived or real, tends to increase competition. Abundance often allows cooperation, but not always. Fear can narrow focus. Safety can encourage creativity. These patterns show up again and again across cultures and eras. They're the kind of regularities an observer would likely note, not with judgment, but with interest. Even our myths and stories reflect this tension. Humans have always imagined watchers, gods, ancestors, spirits, judges, record keepers, beings who see what we do when we think no one is looking. These stories often serve moral purposes, encouraging certain behaviours and discouraging others, but they also suggest a deep-rooted intuition that our actions matter beyond immediate consequences, that something, somewhere, is paying attention, even if we can't say exactly what. Of course, there's a simpler explanation for all of this. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We look for meaning because meaning helps us navigate uncertainty. The idea that we might be part of an experiment could simply be another narrative, a way to frame existence in a way that feels structured rather than chaotic. That possibility shouldn't be dismissed. Skepticism is part of the same curiosity that raises the question in the first place. Still, there's something quietly useful about entertaining the idea, even if only as a thought exercise. If you imagine just for a moment that humanity is being observed, not judged, not steered, just watched, what changes? Do everyday actions feel heavier or lighter? Does kindness become more significant or less? Does the absence of clear instructions make behaviour feel more authentic? Interestingly, many people report that imagining an observer doesn't make them feel constrained. It makes them feel reflective. They become more aware of their choices, not because someone might reward or punish them, but because the choices themselves seem to carry weight. In that sense, the experiment isn't something being done to humans. It's something humans participate in simply by being conscious. As we sit with this idea, it's worth noting how rarely life provides definitive answers. Science thrives on uncertainty, on questions that remain open long enough to be examined from multiple angles. Philosophy does the same, though with different tools. Sleep, too, is a kind of letting go of certainty. You don't fall asleep by solving the day. You fall asleep by loosening your grip on it. So for now, there's no need to decide whether humans are an experiment, a coincidence, a deliberate creation, or something else entirely. The value of the question lies in how it shifts attention. It invites you to step slightly outside your usual narrative and look at yourself and your species as part of a much larger process, unfolding slowly, without commentary. There is a particular comfort in believing that we're in control, and it's a comfort most of us rarely question. It sits quietly beneath everyday decisions, beneath routines so familiar they hardly register as choices at all. You wake up when the alarm goes off, or when your body decides it has rested enough. You decide what to eat, where to go, what to ignore, what to worry about later. None of it feels imposed, it feels chosen, and that feeling is important, because without it, even simple actions would begin to feel strangely hollow. From early on, control is framed as something desirable. Children are encouraged to make choices, to learn independence, to take responsibility. Adults are praised for self-discipline, planning and foresight. Entire cultures are built around the idea that effort leads to outcomes, that careful decisions produce predictable results. Even when life doesn't cooperate, the underlying belief remains. If things went wrong, it's because of a mistake, a missed opportunity, or bad luck. But still, control is assumed to be the default state, briefly interrupted rather than fundamentally absent. What's interesting is how rarely this assumption is examined closely. It doesn't need defending most of the time, because it feels obvious. Of course we're in control. Who else would be? And yet, when you begin to slow down and look at how decisions actually form, the edges of that certainty start to blur in subtle ways. Take something simple, like deciding what to think about next. Right now, you're listening to these words. But did you choose to focus on this sentence instead of the sound in the room, or the sensation in your body, or a thought that briefly tried to interrupt? Attention shifts constantly, often without permission. You can guide it, but not command it outright. Anyone who has tried to quiet a restless mind at night knows how stubborn it can be. Thoughts arrive whether invited or not. Control, in that context, feels more like negotiation. Biology adds another layer. Much of what shapes behaviour happens beneath conscious awareness. Hormones rise and fall, influencing mood and motivation. Neural patterns formed years ago quietly steer reactions before logic has time to intervene. A smell can trigger a memory. A tone of voice can spark irritation or comfort without any deliberate reasoning. None of this means choice is an illusion, but it does suggest that choice operates within boundaries we don't set ourselves. Social structures tighten those boundaries further. Language, norms, expectations, and unspoken rules shape what feels possible or acceptable long before an individual ever reflects on them. You don't choose your first language, yet it frames how you categorize the world. You don't choose the era you're born into, yet it determines which technologies feel normal, which risks seem distant, and which futures appear imaginable. Control exists, but it exists inside a framework that was already there when you arrived. Still, the sense of being in control persists, and for good reason. Without it, planning would collapse, motivation would falter, responsibility would lose its meaning. The belief that actions matter is deeply tied to mental health and social stability. People who feel completely powerless tend to disengage, to withdraw, or to act destructively. A certain degree of perceived control isn't just comforting, it's necessary. That necessity makes the idea of an unseen framework particularly unsettling. If humans were part of an experiment, the assumption of control wouldn't be removed, it would be preserved. Subjects who believe they are acting freely provide far richer data than those who feel manipulated. The most informative behaviours emerge when people think their decisions are their own, when they respond authentically rather than defensively. This is something researchers already understand. In psychological studies, participants are often given incomplete information, not to deceive them maliciously, but to prevent their awareness from altering the outcome. The more someone knows they're being studied, the more their behaviour shifts toward what they think is expected. True spontaneity becomes difficult, so the absence of obvious oversight isn't evidence against observation. In many contexts, it's a prerequisite for it. There's also the way control is experienced unevenly. Some moments feel decisive, charged with intention. Others feel automatic, almost scripted. You've probably had days where hours passed without much memory of how you filled them. Not because you were unconscious, but because nothing demanded active choice. Routine took over. Habits ran quietly in the background. From the inside, those periods don't feel controlled or uncontrolled. They simply feel neutral. If someone were observing from the outside, however, those differences would stand out. Peaks of deliberate action, valleys of repetition, patterns repeating across individuals who have never met, shaped by similar pressures and incentives. The illusion of complete autonomy would soften into something more statistical, more conditional. And yet, there are moments when people do act against pattern. They resist expectation. They make choices that cost them something, with no clear benefit. Acts of generosity towards strangers, whistleblowing that risks careers, creative leaps that defy practicality. These moments are often held up as evidence of true free will, and they are compelling. But even here, context matters. Values are learned. Moral frameworks are inherited and refined. What feels like a break from control may still be a response to internalized principles that were shaped over time. None of this diminishes the meaning of choice. If anything, it adds texture to it. Decisions become less like isolated points of command and more like the visible surface of a deeper process. Control, in this view, isn't about total independence. It's about participation. You influence outcomes, but you don't author the entire system in which those outcomes occur. That distinction matters when considering the idea of experimentation. An experiment doesn't require puppets, it requires agents, systems that respond, adapt, and occasionally surprise. Total predictability would be boring. Total randomness would be useless. The most interesting data lives in the space between, where behaviour is constrained but not fixed, guided but not dictated. Human history sits squarely in that space. Large-scale patterns repeat with unsettling consistency. Power concentrates. Resources are contested. Innovations spread unevenly. And yet the details are endlessly varied. Cultures diverge. Ideas emerge in one place and not another. Individuals change the course of events in ways no model could fully anticipate. Control exists, but it's distributed, fragmented, and often indirect. It's also worth noticing how strongly people resist challenges to this assumption. Suggestions that free will might be limited, or that behaviour could be largely shaped by unseen forces, tend to provoke discomfort or defensiveness. This isn't just philosophical stubbornness, it's protective. Questioning control threatens identity. If you're not fully in charge, what does that say about your successes or failures? About responsibility or blame? This resistance itself would be informative to an observer. The lengths to which humans go to preserve a sense of agency, even in the face of evidence that complicates it, reveals something important about psychological survival. Control isn't just about power, it's about coherence. It helps people maintain a stable narrative about who they are and why their lives unfold the way they do. Interestingly, the modern world has made this tension more visible. Algorithms predict preferences with unsettling accuracy. Data models anticipate behaviour before individuals consciously decide. People are shown content tailored to their past actions, nudging future ones in subtle ways. Many still insist they're unaffected, that their choices remain independent. Others feel uneasily exposed, as if control is slipping through cracks they didn't know existed. Yet even here, the story isn't simple. People push back. They change habits deliberately. They resist recommendations. Awareness alters interaction. Control reasserts itself, not as dominance, but as dialogue. This back and forth between influence and resistance is where much of modern life unfolds. If humans are the experiment, this dynamic would be central. How do intelligent agents respond when their environment adapts to them? How does perceived control shift when influence becomes visible? Does awareness strengthen autonomy or merely change its expression? These aren't abstract questions. They're playing out quietly every day. The assumption of control also shapes how people interpret suffering. When things go wrong, there's a tendency to search for personal causes. Something must have been done incorrectly. Someone must be at fault. This makes sense in a system where control is expected. But it also leads to guilt and self-blame that may not be warranted. Many outcomes result from complex interactions far beyond any individual's reach. From an experimental perspective, this internalization is revealing. Subjects who believe they control outcomes may respond to failure differently than those who see it as external. Motivation, resilience, and cooperation all shift, depending on where control is perceived to reside. Again, not as moral judgments, but as observable effects. There's a quiet irony here. The belief in control may be one of the strongest shaping forces of human behaviour, regardless of how accurate it is. People act as if their choices matter, and because they act that way, those choices often do matter, at least locally. Control becomes a self-reinforcing experience, not absolute, but functional. This raises a subtle possibility. Perhaps the experiment, if there is one, isn't about testing whether humans are free or constrained. Perhaps it's about observing what happens when a system is allowed to believe both at once, when agents operate under the assumption of autonomy within a world that constantly reminds them of limits. when meaning is constructed in the gap between intention and outcome. As you sit with this idea, there's no need to resolve it. There's no requirement to decide whether control is real, partial, or illusory. The point isn't to undermine your sense of agency or replace it with suspicion. It's simply to notice how naturally the assumption arises, how deeply it's woven into everyday experience, and how quietly it shapes reactions to nearly everything. Control feels solid most of the time because it needs to. It allows life to move forward without constant hesitation. But when you slow down enough to examine it, it becomes less like a lever and more like a current. You can steer within it, sometimes strongly, sometimes barely at all, but you're always moving through something larger than yourself. And if this were an experiment, that balance would be exactly what makes it worth watching. Not domination, not chaos, but the ongoing tension between choice and circumstance, playing out across countless lives, moment by moment, without announcing itself as anything other than ordinary existence. Most people, when they hear the word experiment, imagine something very specific. A controlled room, white walls, clear instructions, someone taking notes from behind a clipboard or a screen, variables adjusted one at a time, results measured, compared, summarized. It feels deliberate, obvious, and external. You know when you're in an experiment because someone tells you, or at least because the setting announces itself in unmistakable ways. But that image comes from the outside looking in. From the inside, experiments almost never feel like experiments. They feel like situations, circumstances, routines, challenges that seem to arise naturally, without explanation or framing. When you're part of a system being observed, especially a complex one, there is rarely a moment where a voice says, "This is the test." Life simply continues, and whatever is being measured unfolds quietly within it. Think about how humans already conduct experiments on each other, often without intending to. Social systems change policies, companies adjust algorithms, cities redesign streets, schools alter curricula, entire populations respond, adapt, resist, comply, or creatively misuse what they are given. From the participant's perspective, these are just changes to daily life. New rules, new tools, new pressures. Only later, sometimes much later, does anyone step back and analyze the patterns that emerged. The subjects don't experience variables. They experience inconvenience, opportunity, confusion, relief, stress, or curiosity. They don't feel like data points. They feel like people reacting to whatever happens to be in front of them. This is one of the most important things to understand if you want to imagine what a large-scale experiment would actually feel like from within. There would be no clear edges, no sense of stepping into or out of it, no baseline moment where you could say, "Before the experiment started." The experiment would be indistinguishable from the environment itself. Consider long-term psychological studies. Even when participants are told they are being studied, the awareness fades. After a while, questionnaires become routine. Observations blur into the background. People revert to habitual behavior because maintaining constant self-awareness is exhausting. The mind settles back into what it always does, navigating the present moment rather than performing for an invisible audience. Now remove even that minimal awareness. Remove consent forms, study briefings, time limits. Stretch the scale from months to generations. At that point, the idea of being in an experiment would feel almost meaningless from the inside. There would be nothing to compare it to. Life would still feel like life. You would still worry about ordinary things, health, relationships, money, belonging. You would still make plans and abandon them. You would still be surprised by outcomes you didn't expect. The fact that someone, somewhere, might be interested in how those reactions unfold would not change the texture of the experience itself. This is where popular ideas about experimentation often go wrong. They assume that observation must feel invasive, or oppressive, or theatrical. But in practice, the most informative experiments are often the quietest ones, the ones that interfere as little as possible, the ones that let systems reveal themselves rather than forcing them into artificial conditions. From the inside, those experiments feel neutral, sometimes boring, sometimes stressful, occasionally meaningful, but rarely dramatic. There is also a tendency to assume that experiments are short and goal-oriented, that they aim toward a clear conclusion. In reality, many experiments evolve as they go. Early assumptions are revised, unexpected variables appear, new questions replace old ones. The process becomes less about confirming a hypothesis and more about understanding a system well enough to know what questions are worth asking next. If humans were part of an experiment, it would almost certainly be this kind: open-ended, adaptive, less concerned with proving a single idea, and more interested in mapping behaviour across changing conditions. The rise and fall of cooperation, the effects of scarcity and abundance, the ways technology alters social bonds, the thresholds at which curiosity turns into exploitation or empathy turns into exhaustion. From the inside, none of this would feel like data collection. It would feel like history happening. One of the clearest indicators that you're inside an experiment rather than observing one is the absence of feedback. In most human-designed experiments, participants eventually receive results. They are told what was being studied, what was learned, how their contribution mattered. That closure reinforces trust and meaning. But from inside a truly large system, feedback may never arrive. Or it may arrive only indirectly, filtered through consequences rather than explanations. You try something, it works or it doesn't. You adjust. Others adjust differently. Patterns form without anyone announcing them. Human societies already function this way. Economic systems respond to incentives, then collapse under pressures no one fully anticipated. Cultural movements emerge, spread, fragment, and dissolve. Individuals feel swept along by forces they didn't vote for and can't clearly name. From the inside, this doesn't feel like being studied. It feels like uncertainty. Uncertainty is a crucial feature here. Experiments designed to reveal authentic behaviour must allow for not knowing. If outcomes are predictable, observation adds little. It is the unknown reactions that matter most. Confusion, disagreement, creativity, error. All of these are informative precisely because they aren't scripted. And confusion, notably, feels very different from manipulation. When people feel manipulated, they sense an external hand pushing them. When they feel confused, they sense complexity. They struggle to understand a system that doesn't quite respond the way they expect. Confusion invites interpretation rather than rebellion. That distinction matters. A system that wants to observe rather than control would tolerate confusion far better than resistance. It would allow ambiguity to persist. It would not rush to clarify meanings or intentions. In fact, it might deliberately remain silent. Silence is often misunderstood as absence. But in observation, silence can be a method. When you intervene too often, you contaminate the process. When you explain too much, you collapse possibilities. Allowing subjects to generate their own interpretations provides richer insight into how meaning is constructed. From the inside, that silence can feel unsettling. Humans are meaning-making creatures. When explanations are lacking, we invent them. We build narratives. We assign motives. We search for patterns, even where none were intended. These responses themselves become dirty, revealing how minds cope with ambiguity. History is full of moments where people filled explanatory gaps with myths, ideologies, or conspiracies. Sometimes these stories stabilized societies. Sometimes they fractured them. Either way, they shape behavior powerfully. From an observational standpoint, those stories are not errors, they are outputs. Another important feature of experiments from the inside is that they often feel unfair, not necessarily cruel, but uneven. Some participants receive advantages, others do not. Some conditions appear arbitrary. Outcomes don't distribute evenly according to effort or virtue. This perceived unfairness generates strong reactions: resentment, solidarity, protest, withdrawal. Again, these reactions are informative. Fairness is not a requirement for experimentation. Variability is. Differences in starting conditions reveal how systems respond to inequality, whether cooperation increases or decreases, whether conflict escalates or stabilizes, whether shared identity emerges or dissolves. From the inside, though, unfairness feels personal. It feels like something is wrong. People demand explanations. They look for someone to blame. They seek control where none is readily available. This emotional response is not incidental. It is central to understanding behavior under stress. It's also worth noting that being inside an experiment does not require passivity. Subjects act. They innovate. They push boundaries. In some cases, they even alter the conditions of the experiment itself. This doesn't invalidate the observation. It enriches it. Humanity has repeatedly changed the parameters of its own existence. Agriculture reshaped ecosystems. Industrialization altered climate and social structure. Digital technology transformed communication and identity. Each shift introduced new variables that no one fully understood at the time. From the inside, these changes felt like progress, or disruption, or both. From the outside, they would look like natural extensions of a system exploring its own limits. That self-modifying quality is particularly interesting. Many experiments assume static subjects. Humans are not static. They learn. They adapt. They reflect on their own behavior and attempt to change it. They generate theories about themselves and act on those theories. This reflexivity creates feedback loops that complicate prediction. From the inside, reflexivity feels like growth or self-awareness. From the outside, it looks like a system becoming increasingly complex, capable of modelling itself. Whether that complexity stabilizes or destabilizes the system over time would be a key observation. There is also the matter of scale. Individual lives feel short, urgent, pressed for time. From that perspective, it's easy to assume that any experiment involving humans would have to operate on a similar timeline. But experiments don't experience time the way subjects do. A century can be a brief phase, a millennium, a data segment. From the inside, generations feel like beginnings and endings. From the outside, they are iterations. This mismatch in temporal perspective is another reason experiments don't announce themselves. If you knew you were part of something that would outlast you by orders of magnitude, your behavior might change. You might feel insignificant, or reckless, or overly idealistic. Letting subjects experience their own timescale preserves authenticity. What about suffering? This is where the idea becomes most uncomfortable. People often assume that if humans were being observed, suffering would imply neglect or malice. But observation does not require intervention, and intervention does not guarantee improvement. Even human-designed experiments struggle with ethical trade-offs, unintended consequences, and limited foresight. From the inside, suffering feels immediate and unjustifiable. From the outside, it appears as a variable with cascading effects. How do communities respond to loss? Does hardship fracture trust or deepen it? Does prolonged stress erode empathy or refine it? These are not abstract questions. They are patterns that repeat across history. Importantly, recognizing this does not mean endorsing suffering or dismissing it as necessary. It simply acknowledges that suffering already exists within systems humans create and maintain. Whether observed or not, it shapes behavior profoundly. Another misconception is that experiments require constant monitoring. In reality, many systems can be sampled intermittently. You don't need to watch every moment to understand trends. This means long stretches of apparent neglect would feel normal from the inside. Nothing watching, nothing intervening, just life unfolding. That absence of visible oversight reinforces the assumption of autonomy. People feel alone with their choices, responsible for outcomes, unseen. That feeling itself drives behaviour in specific directions. It encourages internal moral frameworks rather than external compliance. Again, from an observational standpoint, that distinction matters. There is also the possibility that experiments do not seek to answer a question about outcomes at all, but about processes. Not whether humans succeed or fail, but how they narrate success and failure. How they assign meaning, how they cope with uncertainty, finitude, and complexity. From the inside, this looks like philosophy, art, religion, and science emerging side by side. Different strategies for making sense of existence, some conflicting, some overlapping, some evolving into institutions that shape behaviour long after their origins are forgotten. If you were inside such an experiment, you wouldn't feel studied. You would feel human, curious, frustrated, hopeful, distracted. You would argue about what matters. You would disagree about what is real. You would build tools to extend your reach and stories to explain why you did so. And crucially, you would still sleep. You would still need rest. Even the most unsettling questions lose their sharpness when the body begins to relax. The mind drifts not because it has found answers, but because it can't sustain vigilance forever. That too would be part of the observation, how awareness ebbs and flows, how certainty dissolves into habit, how questions fade into the background and then resurface later, slightly changed. So when imagining what experiments really look like from the inside, it's worth setting aside dramatic imagery. No glass walls, no alarms, no sudden revelations, just a system unfolding, moment by moment, experienced as ordinary life by those within it. If you were inside a laboratory that didn't want to be noticed, it wouldn't look like a laboratory at all. There would be no signs, no warnings, no sterile surfaces, or controlled lighting designed to signal that something artificial was taking place. Instead, it would feel natural, familiar, a place where things grow, decay, collide, adapt, and repeat without ever explaining themselves. From the inside, it would simply feel like the world. Earth fits that description almost too well. From the moment humans began to reflect on their surroundings, Earth has presented itself as both stable and unpredictable. The ground beneath your feet feels solid, dependable, something you can trust to be there when you stand up. At the same time, it shifts. Plates move, volcanoes erupt, earthquakes arrive without consulting calendars. Stability exists, but it is conditional, not guaranteed. That balance alone creates an environment where behaviour is shaped continuously by a mix of confidence and uncertainty. A laboratory doesn't need constant interference to produce results. In fact, the most informative setups are often those that establish initial conditions and then step back. Earth's physical laws are remarkably consistent. Gravity behaves the same way every time. Chemistry follows reliable rules. Energy moves through systems in ways that can be modelled and predicted. These regularities form the baseline, the equivalent of a controlled environment. Within that baseline, variation thrives. Climate zones differ dramatically. Resources are unevenly distributed. Some regions offer abundance with minimal effort, while others demand cooperation, innovation, or endurance simply to survive. These differences are not subtle. They create distinct pressures that shape societies in measurable ways. Mobility, conflict, trade, belief systems, all respond to geography as much as to intention. From the inside, this doesn't feel like design. It feels like luck or misfortune. You're born into a place, into conditions you didn't choose, and you adapt as best you can. But from an observational standpoint, these variations function exactly like experimental conditions. How does intelligence express itself in isolation versus connectivity? What kinds of social structures emerge where survival depends on cooperation compared to competition? How do belief systems differ in environments that feel generous versus hostile? Earth doesn't announce these questions, it simply provides the setting. Another feature of effective laboratories is timescale. Short experiments capture immediate reactions. Long experiments reveal deeper patterns. Earth operates on timescales that dwarf individual lifespans. Seasons repeat predictably, but overlaid on that rhythm are slow changes that only become visible across generations. Climate shifts. Species migrate or disappear. Landscapes transform. Humans, from the inside, experience these changes as history, as stories passed down, as traditions formed and forgotten. But from the outside, those same changes look like data points in a slow-moving system. How do cultures respond to gradual stress versus sudden catastrophe? Which adaptations persist, and which collapse under pressure? What makes Earth particularly effective as a laboratory is that it does not isolate variables cleanly. Many experiments aim for simplicity. One factor changed at a time. Earth does the opposite. Variables interact constantly. Biological systems influence climate. Climate reshapes biology. Technology alters ecosystems. Ecosystems push back. Feedback loops form and dissolve. From the inside, this complexity feels overwhelming. Problems resist simple solutions. Interventions produce unintended consequences. Plans succeed in one place and fail in another. People argue endlessly about causes and responsibilities. That confusion is not a flaw. It is what happens when a system is complex enough to generate emergent behaviour. A laboratory that announces itself tends to narrow attention. Participants focus on the test, on performance, on expected outcomes. A laboratory that blends into existence allows attention to wander. Humans pursue goals unrelated to any hypothetical observation. They seek comfort, meaning, status, connection. They invent art, conflict, humour, and ritual. These pursuits may seem irrelevant from a narrow scientific view, but they are precisely what make behaviour rich enough to observe. Earth also supplies constraints that feel arbitrary from the inside. Finite resources, physical vulnerability, aging, mortality. These limits shape behaviour more powerfully than any instruction ever could. When time is limited, priorities shift. When survival is not guaranteed, cooperation and conflict both intensify. When bodies are fragile, care and fear become central features of social life. An experiment that wanted to observe how intelligence copes with limitation could hardly design a better setup. Importantly, Earth does not enforce a single path. Humans have repeatedly demonstrated the capacity to organize themselves in radically different ways within the same physical constraints. Some societies emphasize hierarchy, others flatten it. Some value individual expression, others collective stability. These differences arise not because the environment dictates them directly, but because the environment leaves room for interpretation. Interpretation is where much of the data would live. Faced with the same sun, the same gravity, the same biological needs, humans tell different stories about what matters. They build different moral frameworks. They argue about fairness, responsibility, and purpose. These arguments are not noise, they are signals. They show how meaning is constructed under shared constraints. Earth also provides isolation without total separation. Oceans divide continents, slowing interaction without preventing it entirely. Mountains, deserts, and forests act as barriers that shape development, while still allowing occasional exchange. This creates natural comparisons. Cultures evolve in relative independence, then meet, clash, merge, or erase each other. From the inside, these encounters feel like destiny, discovery, invasion, or tragedy. From the outside, they resemble comparative trials. How do different solutions to similar problems interact when brought into contact? Which ideas spread and which resist? What survives hybridization and what dissolves? Another understated feature is noise. Earth is noisy, not just acoustically, but informationally. Signals overlap. Causes are hard to trace. Outcomes have multiple contributors. This noise makes simple explanations unreliable. Humans struggle to agree on why things happen, even when evidence is abundant. That struggle itself reveals cognitive biases, social incentives, and limits of perception. A laboratory that wanted to test reasoning under uncertainty would benefit from exactly this kind of noise. Too much clarity produces artificial confidence. Ambiguity forces inference. From inside the system, ambiguity feels frustrating. People demand certainty. They crave clear answers. When they don't get them, they polarize, simplify, or disengage. Again, these responses are not errors. They are behaviors worth observing. Earth also does something subtle with scale. Individual actions feel small. Global consequences feel abstract. This mismatch creates ethical tension. People care deeply about what they can see and touch, and struggle to respond to distant or long-term effects. Environmental damage accumulates slowly. Social shifts emerge over decades. From the inside, urgency competes with immediacy. If humans were being observed, this gap between awareness and action would be significant. Knowledge does not automatically translate into behavior. Values compete, incentives distort. Short-term comfort often outweighs long-term stability. None of this requires malicious intent. It arises naturally from how cognition evolved in environments where immediate threats mattered more than distant ones. Earth's feedback mechanisms are also delayed. Consequences don't always follow actions quickly or clearly. This makes learning imperfect. Systems drift before correcting. Some corrections come too late. From an observational perspective, delayed feedback reveals how systems cope with uncertainty and error. From the inside, it feels like confusion or denial. Another aspect worth noticing is that Earth allows observation without surveillance. There are no obvious instruments watching from the sky, no universal awareness of being tracked. Humans often imagine that observation must be visible to be effective, but in complex systems, indirect observation can be sufficient. Outcomes speak. Patterns accumulate. Individual moments need not be recorded if aggregate behavior is the focus. That invisibility preserves authenticity. People act according to their own motivations, not to please or resist an observer. Even when humans invent the idea of watchers, gods, ancestors, algorithms, the imagined presence varies across cultures and individuals. The observer becomes part of the system, shaping behavior indirectly rather than directly. Earth also supports redundancy. Multiple ecosystems, multiple cultures, multiple technologies. Failure in one area does not necessarily end the experiment. Collapse can occur locally while the system continues globally. This resilience allows observation across a wide range of conditions without total reset. From the inside, collapse feels catastrophic. From the outside, it may appear as transition. It's important to be careful here. Viewing Earth as a laboratory does not mean diminishing the reality of suffering or loss. It does not mean events are trivial or justified by observation. The internal experience remains real, intense, and meaningful regardless of any external framing. A laboratory does not negate experience, it contextualizes it. In fact, one of the most striking features of Earth is how intensely real life feels from the inside, despite how small individual lives appear from a cosmic scale. Joy matters, pain matters, relationships matter. That depth of experience is itself remarkable. If consciousness were being observed, Earth provides an extraordinarily vivid range of it. There is also the question of intervention. Laboratories sometimes adjust conditions mid-experiment. Earth does not show obvious signs of that. Or if it does, they are subtle enough to be endlessly debated. Natural disasters are indistinguishable from randomness. Technological leaps arise from human ingenuity rather than external gifts. There are no clear messages written into the sky. This absence of obvious intervention reinforces the sense of autonomy. Humans feel responsible for what they build and destroy. They argue about accountability. They assign praise and blame. That moral activity is central to social life. It would also be central to observing how intelligent agents govern themselves. Earth does not explain itself. It does not tell humans why it exists, or why it has the properties it does. Science uncovers mechanisms, but not purpose. That gap invites philosophy, religion, speculation. Humans fill the silence with meaning. Again, from an observational standpoint, those meanings are not distractions. They are expressions. If this were a laboratory, its most convincing feature would be how little it feels like one. No instruction manual, no progress bar, no clear endpoint. Just a setting that allows behaviour to unfold, complexity to build, and awareness to question itself. From the inside, that questioning feels personal, existential, sometimes exhausting, sometimes comforting. It arises naturally in a world that offers stability without explanation, and change without warning. As this idea settles, there's no need to accept it as literal. You don't have to believe Earth is a laboratory to notice how laboratory-like it can appear when viewed from a distance. The point is not belief, it's perspective, a slight shift that allows familiar things to be seen under a different light. Curiosity doesn't announce itself as something important. It doesn't arrive with authority or demand attention the way fear or hunger does. Most of the time it feels small, a brief question, a glance held a second longer than necessary, a thought that begins with why, and then quietly trails off when something more urgent takes its place. And yet, if there were one variable that quietly shaped nearly everything humans do, curiosity would be a strong candidate. From the inside, curiosity feels optional. You can indulge it or ignore it. You can follow it for years or dismiss it in seconds. There is no obvious penalty for letting it fade, at least not immediately. You can live a full day, even a full life, focused entirely on obligations, routines, and known outcomes. Curiosity doesn't force itself into survival the way breathing or eating does. But over longer stretches of time, curiosity leaves traces everywhere. It's there in the first stone tools, not because hunger demanded sharper edges, but because someone wondered whether a different shape might work better. It's there in early navigation, in people looking at the horizon and asking what might be beyond it. It's there in questions about the sky, the body, the mind, questions that offered no immediate advantage but refused to stay quiet. If humans were part of an experiment, curiosity would be difficult to ignore, not because it always produces useful results, but because it changes the trajectory of behaviour in unpredictable ways. A species without curiosity remains stable. A species with it becomes restless. From an observational perspective, curiosity is fascinating precisely because it is inefficient. It leads people down paths that do not clearly serve survival. It motivates risk-taking without guaranteed reward. It draws attention toward abstract problems that may never be solved. This inefficiency is revealing. It suggests that behaviour is not driven solely by optimization, but by something more exploratory. Humans already treat curiosity as something to be managed. Children are encouraged to ask questions, but not too many. Education systems reward certain kinds of curiosity while discouraging others. Workplaces value curiosity when it leads to innovation, but not when it disrupts hierarchy or timelines. Curiosity is praised in theory and constrained in practice. That tension would be informative to anyone watching. Notice how curiosity behaves under pressure. In environments where survival feels precarious, curiosity often narrows. Attention focuses on immediate needs. Long-term questions are postponed. In more stable conditions, curiosity expands. People explore art, philosophy, science, and speculation that would seem indulgent in harsher circumstances. This fluctuation alone reveals something important. Curiosity is sensitive to context, but it doesn't disappear entirely. Even in the most constrained environments, people remain curious about something. Each other, escape, meaning, the future, the past. Curiosity adapts rather than vanishing. From the inside, curiosity feels personal. You're interested in what you're interested in. Preferences seem individual, shaped by taste or personality. But when observed at scale, patterns emerge. Entire populations become curious about similar things at the same time. New technologies spread. New fears capture attention. New questions dominate conversation. These waves of shared curiosity are not coordinated consciously, yet they move through societies with remarkable speed. That collective behaviour would be difficult to miss from the outside. Curiosity also has a destabilising effect. It undermines certainty. Once a question is asked, it cannot easily be unasked. This is why curiosity is sometimes treated as dangerous. It erodes fixed beliefs. It exposes contradictions. It invites comparison between what is assumed and what is observed. Systems built on rigid narratives tend to suppress curiosity, not because curiosity is wrong, but because it is disruptive. It asks for evidence. It asks for explanation. It asks what happens if things are done differently. From the inside, this can feel like disloyalty or rebellion. From the outside, it looks like a system testing its own boundaries. If humans were being observed, moments when curiosity overrides caution would stand out. People pursue knowledge despite risk. They investigate phenomena that challenge their own identities or social standing. They ask questions that make life more complicated rather than simpler. Curiosity also behaves strangely in relation to satisfaction. Answers do not usually end it, they redirect it. Solving one problem often creates several new ones. Understanding deepens uncertainty rather than eliminating it. This is not a flaw in curiosity, it is its defining feature. From an experimental standpoint, this self-propagating quality is significant. Curiosity generates its own momentum. It does not require constant external stimulation. Once activated, it can sustain itself through frustration, failure, and ambiguity. That persistence makes curiosity measurable, not in numbers, but in consequences. Societies that cultivate it change faster. Technologies accelerate. Moral frameworks are challenged. Worldviews expand or fracture. Societies that suppress it stagnate or rigidify. Neither outcome is inherently good or bad, but the differences are stark. From the inside, these shifts feel like progress or decay, depending on perspective. From the outside, they look like divergence under different conditions. Another subtle aspect of curiosity is that it often appears irrational in the short term. People invest time and energy into pursuits with no clear payoff. They explore ideas that may never be validated. They ask questions whose answers could unsettle them. This willingness to tolerate uncertainty is unusual in systems optimized purely for efficiency. If curiosity were being measured, tolerance for uncertainty would be one of its key indicators. How long will a system sit with not knowing? How much ambiguity can individuals endure before retreating into certainty, even false certainty? Humans vary widely here. Some lean into uncertainty, finding it stimulating. Others find it deeply uncomfortable, seeking closure as quickly as possible. These differences shape careers, beliefs, relationships, and conflicts. From an observational view, they reveal cognitive diversity within the species. Curiosity also competes with fear. When fear dominates, curiosity shrinks. When safety increases, curiosity resurfaces. But fear never disappears entirely, which means curiosity is always operating under constraint. This balance produces nuanced behaviour. People explore cautiously. They test boundaries incrementally. They retreat and advance in cycles. That cyclical pattern would be especially interesting to observe over long periods. Periods of exploration followed by retrenchment. Expansion followed by consolidation. Innovation followed by regulation. These cycles repeat across domains, suggesting that curiosity is not a constant force, but a variable one, responsive to conditions. From the inside, these cycles feel historical. From the outside, they resemble oscillations. There is also the way curiosity turns inward. Humans do not only ask about the world, they ask about themselves, why they feel what they feel, why they think what they think, why others behave differently. This self-directed curiosity fuels psychology, philosophy, and introspection. It also fuels anxiety and doubt. Self-curiosity is particularly revealing. It shows a system capable of modelling itself, questioning its own processes, and attempting self-modification. That reflexivity is rare in natural systems. It complicates prediction. It introduces feedback loops where observation changes behaviour. If curiosity were being measured, moments when humans turn it inward would be crucial data points. How does a system respond when it becomes aware of its own patterns? Does that awareness lead to growth, paralysis, or conflict? Humans already show all three. Another feature worth noticing is how curiosity spreads. It is contagious. Interest expressed by one person can ignite interest in another. Shared questions create communities. Entire disciplines emerge from collective curiosity, sustained across generations. Knowledge is passed down not because it is immediately useful, but because it once answered someone's question and might answer another's. From the inside, this looks like culture. From the outside, it looks like information persistence. Curiosity also interacts with power in telling ways. Those with resources can afford to be curious longer. They can explore without immediate return. Those without resources must prioritize survival. This creates disparities in who gets to ask questions and which questions are pursued. If humans were being observed, this uneven distribution would matter. It shows how curiosity is shaped not just by individual inclination, but by structural conditions. It also shows how ideas tend to reflect the perspectives of those with the freedom to explore them. And yet, curiosity finds ways around constraint. It appears in informal learning, in storytelling, in experimentation outside institutions. It adapts. It finds expression even when officially discouraged. That resilience suggests it is not merely a cultural luxury, but a deeper cognitive drive. From an experimental lens, curiosity might be less about what humans know, and more about how they approach the unknown. Do they approach it with openness or defensiveness? With patience or urgency? With cooperation or competition? These orientations shape outcomes far more than raw intelligence alone. Curiosity also changes with age. Children display it freely, often without filter. Adults learn to manage it, to prioritize. Older adults may return to it in quieter ways, reflecting rather than expanding. These shifts reveal how curiosity is negotiated across a lifespan. From the inside, this feels natural. From the outside, it looks like a variable modulated by experience and responsibility. It's worth noting that curiosity does not always lead to benevolent outcomes. It can drive exploitation as easily as understanding. Humans have explored not just to learn, but to extract. Not just to observe, but to dominate. Curiosity itself is neutral. Its expression depends on values and constraints. That neutrality makes it especially interesting. It cannot be reduced to morality. It simply opens doors. What people choose to do once those doors are open reveals far more. If humans are the experiment, curiosity might be the variable that determines how fast the experiment evolves, not toward a goal, but toward complexity. Curiosity accelerates change. It destabilizes equilibrium. It pushes systems away from stasis. From the inside, this can feel exhausting. Change demands adaptation. Adaptation demands effort. Many people long for certainty, for settled answers, for an end to questioning. And yet, curiosity persists, even when resisted. As you sit with this idea, notice how curiosity feels in your own body right now. Not as excitement, but as a gentle pull, a willingness to keep listening, a tolerance for not resolving the question immediately. That sensation is familiar, but easy to overlook. There is no need to decide whether curiosity is being measured, rewarded, or simply unfolding. The point is that it is there, shaping behaviour quietly, persistently, across scales of time most individuals never perceive. There is a moment that arrives quietly when you've been watching something for long enough, where repetition begins to stand out. At first, everything feels chaotic. Events seem disconnected. Causes blur into effects and outcomes feel random or unfair. But given time, certain shapes begin to emerge. Not clear answers, not rules carved in stone, but tendencies, familiar arcs, behaviours that appear again and again, even when circumstances differ. This is usually where people start using the word pattern. From the inside, patterns are rarely obvious. They are lived through, not charted. You experience one event at a time, one decision, one consequence, often without the luxury of stepping back far enough to compare it to dozens of similar moments unfolding elsewhere. Life feels immediate, personal, specific. It is only later, sometimes much later, that similarities become noticeable, often in hindsight, often tinged with regret or disbelief. How did this happen again? Why does this feel familiar? Humans are exceptionally good at noticing patterns, even when they are incomplete or misleading. In fact, the brain is so tuned to pattern recognition that it will happily invent them when none exist. This tendency has obvious survival benefits. Detecting regularities helps predict danger, opportunity, and change. But it also produces false positives, superstitions, overgeneralizations, narratives that simplify complexity into something easier to hold. If humans were being observed, this behavior would be impossible to miss. Given a sufficiently complex environment, people will search for coherence even when it remains just out of reach. They will connect dots tentatively, revise those connections, argue about them, and sometimes defend them fiercely. Patterns become shared stories, and shared stories become lenses through which future events are interpreted. What makes this especially interesting is how patterns and anomalies depend on each other. A pattern only becomes visible when something repeats. An anomaly only stands out against a background of expectation. Without regularity, there is no surprise. Without surprise, there is no adjustment. Human history is full of this interplay. Economic booms followed by collapses, periods of stability interrupted by sudden upheaval, technological breakthroughs that promise simplicity and instead introduce new layers of complication. These cycles repeat often enough that people come to expect them, even if they cannot predict their timing or form. From the inside, these events feel unique. This crisis is unlike the last one. This innovation changes everything. This conflict is unprecedented, and in certain details that is always true. But from a broader perspective, the outlines remain recognizable. Expectations rise, systems stretch, stress accumulates, something gives. Recovery begins, altered but familiar. An observer watching across centuries would see these cycles not as failures of learning, but as expressions of underlying constraints. Growth encounters limits. Complexity produces fragility. Attempts to control outcomes introduce new vulnerabilities. These are not moral judgments. They are characteristics of dynamic systems populated by agents who act with partial information. Anomalies are where attention sharpens. They are the moments that don't quite fit, a discovery that contradicts accepted models, a cultural shift that defies prediction, an individual who acts against every apparent incentive. These moments attract disproportionate focus because they challenge assumptions. From the inside, anomalies often feel threatening. They destabilize narratives that provide comfort or justification. When something doesn't make sense, people rush to explain it, absorb it, or dismiss it. Rarely do they sit comfortably with not knowing. Anomaly demands response. This response is revealing. Some people revise their models, others double down on existing beliefs. Some isolate the anomaly as an exception, others elevate it into a new rule. These choices shape future patterns. If humans were part of an experiment, anomalies would be especially valuable, not because they are rare, but because they expose the flexibility of belief systems. How much contradiction can a worldview absorb before it fractures? How quickly does a system adapt to new information versus rejecting it? Consider how often humans notice patterns that almost make sense, explanations that feel intuitively right, emotionally satisfying, but fall apart under scrutiny. These partial narratives are everywhere. They persist not because they are accurate, but because they are useful. They offer closure. They reduce anxiety. They give people something to act on. From the inside, these narratives feel like understanding. From the outside, they look like provisional models, constantly updated, rarely discarded entirely. There is something deeply human about preferring an incomplete explanation to none at all. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. The mind seeks resolution. When full clarity is unavailable, approximation will do. This is not irrational, it is adaptive. Action often cannot wait for perfect information. But this habit also means that humans often mistake coherence for truth. A story that hangs together is assumed to reflect reality, even when alternative explanations exist. This bias shapes everything from personal relationships to large-scale policy decisions. If curiosity was the variable, as considered earlier, then pattern making is one of its primary expressions. Curiosity looks for structure. It wants to know how things fit. Anomalies disrupt that fit, prompting either deeper inquiry or defensive simplification. Earth, as a setting, supplies endless opportunities for this dance. Weather behaves predictably until it doesn't. Biological systems follow rules until mutations produce surprises. Social systems enforce norms until enough people challenge them at once. Each disruption forces recalibration. From the inside, recalibration feels reactive. Crisis management, damage control, innovation under pressure. From the outside, it looks like a system exploring its own phase space, testing different configurations under stress. Another layer to this is scale. Patterns visible at one level disappear at another. Individual behavior is noisy. Predicting a single person's choices is difficult. Aggregate behavior, however, is remarkably consistent. Markets fluctuate unpredictably day to day, yet follow recognizable trends over decades. Opinions shift erratically among individuals, yet societies move in discernible directions. This mismatch can be unsettling from the inside. People experience themselves as unpredictable, nuanced, irreducible. Then they encounter statistics that seem to flatten that complexity into probabilities. There is resistance to this reduction, often justified. No one wants to be treated as an average. But from an observational perspective, both levels matter. The noise and the signal, the individual story and the collective arc. Anomalies often begin at the individual level. A single idea, a deviant behavior, a new way of combining existing elements. Most anomalies fade. They fail to propagate. A few resonate, spreading outward, reshaping patterns at larger scales. These moments are difficult to forecast because they depend on context, timing, and receptivity. Humans tend to overestimate intentionality in these processes. They look for masterminds, conspiracies, hidden hands guiding outcomes. Sometimes coordination exists, often it doesn't. Many large shifts emerge from interactions rather than plans. This tendency to attribute agency where there may be none is itself a pattern. It reveals discomfort with randomness and complexity. People prefer narratives with clear actors and motives. An experimenter, if imagined, provides a convenient focal point. Someone must be responsible. But responsibility is often distributed. Outcomes arise from countless small decisions interacting in ways no one fully controls. This diffusion of causality makes sense from a systems perspective, but feels unsatisfying from the inside. There is also the matter of timing. Patterns become visible only after repetition. Anomalies are often recognized only after their consequences unfold. In the moment, everything feels provisional. Humans act without knowing which actions will matter later. This temporal blindness is significant. It means that meaning is often assigned retroactively. Events are interpreted through outcomes rather than intentions. Success is seen as foresight, failure as error. This hindsight bias reinforces the illusion that patterns were obvious all along. From an observational standpoint, this retroactive sense-making is itself data. It shows how humans construct coherence after the fact, smoothing over uncertainty to preserve a sense of order. Some anomalies remain unresolved. They resist integration. Unexplained phenomena linger at the edges of understanding, provoking debate for generations. These unresolved anomalies are particularly interesting because they maintain curiosity without closure. They keep systems open. Humans respond to unresolved anomalies in varied ways. Some keep investigating patiently. Others lose interest. Some mythologize them. Others deny their significance. These divergent responses shape cultural trajectories. There is also a feedback loop between patterns and expectations. Once a pattern is believed to exist, people act as if it does, reinforcing it. Self-fulfilling prophecies emerge. Conversely, expectations of anomaly can produce instability. If people believe disruption is inevitable, they may act in ways that hasten it. This reflexivity complicates observation. The act of noticing patterns changes behavior, which changes patterns. If humans are the experiment, they are not passive subjects. They are participants who continuously adjust based on perceived regularities. From the inside, this feels like learning. From the outside, it looks like a system updating its internal models. What about the things that almost make sense? These are perhaps the most telling. Ideas that explain a lot but not everything. Theories that work until they don't. Beliefs that feel right emotionally but collapse under pressure. Humans cling to these because they are close enough to be useful, far enough to remain flexible. Almost sense is comfortable. It allows progress without paralysis. It permits disagreement without total fragmentation. It leaves room for revision. If an experiment sought to observe how intelligent agents navigate complexity, these near misses would be as informative as clear successes or failures. They show how humans tolerate imperfection in understanding, how they move forward despite incomplete models. From the inside, this tolerance varies. Some people demand precision, others accept ambiguity. These differences influence conflict, collaboration, and innovation. They shape which anomalies become turning points and which fade into background noise. It's also worth noticing how emotional investment interacts with pattern recognition. People are more likely to see patterns that align with their values and identities. Contradictory patterns are dismissed or reinterpreted. This selectivity is not accidental. It protects coherence of self. From an observational perspective, identity-linked pattern recognition is crucial. It explains polarization. It explains why the same data can produce radically different conclusions. It explains why anomalies threaten some groups more than others. Earth provides endless opportunities for these dynamics to play out. It is rich enough, complex enough, and slow enough to allow patterns to form, dissolve, and reform without ever settling into finality. If you step back just slightly, without trying to solve anything, it becomes easier to see how patterns and anomalies coexist without cancelling each other out. Order emerges but never completely. Surprise persists but never entirely. From the inside, this can feel exhausting. The sense that understanding is always just out of reach. That clarity dissolves as soon as it seems close. But this ongoing tension may be precisely what sustains curiosity, adaptation, and engagement. If everything made sense, there would be nothing to explore. If nothing made sense, exploration would feel pointless. The space in between, where things almost make sense, is where human attention lingers. As thoughts begin to slow, as the need to resolve loosens its grip, it's possible to rest in that in-between space without frustration. Not knowing becomes less of a problem and more of a condition. Patterns can be noticed without being forced. Anomalies can exist without explanation. Silence has a particular weight when it stretches on for long enough. At first, it feels neutral, then ambiguous. Eventually, it begins to invite interpretation. Humans are not comfortable with prolonged silence, especially when it follows a question. We expect replies, signals, some indication that our curiosity has been noticed. When none arrives, the absence itself starts to feel meaningful. If there were observers, their most defining feature would not be their presence, but their restraint. From the inside, the universe feels remarkably quiet. There are no announcements, no corrections, no moments where an external voice steps in to clarify what is happening or why. Events unfold without commentary. Discoveries are made without applause. Mistakes compound without interruption. Even moments of profound collective significance pass without any sign that they have been marked or recorded by anything beyond human memory and documentation. This silence is often taken as evidence that no one is watching, and that conclusion is understandable. In everyday human interactions, silence usually signals absence, disinterest, or withdrawal. When someone stops responding, we assume they have left the conversation. But observation does not require participation. In many contexts, silence is the condition for observation to remain uncontaminated. Humans already practice this distinction, even if imperfectly. Wildlife researchers use blinds. Astronomers receive light that has travelled for millions of years without ever sending anything back. Psychologists sometimes observe behaviour indirectly, through patterns and outcomes rather than direct questioning. In each case, the goal is to minimise interference, to see what unfolds when the system is left alone. From the inside, being left alone feels like neglect, or freedom, or both, depending on circumstance. There is a persistent assumption that observation implies guidance, that if someone were watching, they would intervene when things go wrong, correct mistakes, prevent harm, offer reassurance. But this assumption comes from a moral framework shaped by human relationships, not from the logic of observation itself. Watching and caring are not the same action, even if humans often blur them together. This distinction creates discomfort. If observers exist and remain silent, what does that say about intent? Are they indifferent, limited, bound by constraints unknown to us? Or is the silence itself the point? From the inside, these questions spiral easily, because silence offers no resistance. It absorbs interpretation without pushing back. Humans project motives into the quiet the way they project shapes into clouds. The longer the silence lasts, the more elaborate the interpretations become. History is filled with attempts to break this silence. Oracles, rituals, prayers, signals sent into space, mathematical messages carved into stone or transmitted via radio waves. Again and again, humans have tried to announce themselves, to ask if anyone is there, to request acknowledgement. And again, the response has been the same. Nothing discernible. No reply that can be agreed upon. No confirmation or denial. From the inside, this repetition feels either tragic or humbling. Depending on perspective, it reinforces loneliness or independence. Some take the silence as permission to define meaning for themselves. Others experience it as abandonment. If this were an experiment, the silence would be functional. Intervention alters behaviour. Communication changes outcomes. The moment observers respond, the system shifts from natural behaviour to reactive behaviour. Subjects stop acting according to internal motivations and begin acting in response to perceived expectations. The absence of feedback preserves authenticity. That authenticity is not always comfortable. Humans crave validation. They want to know their actions matter beyond immediate consequences. They want reassurance that suffering is seen, that effort is noted, that choices register somewhere. Silence denies that comfort. It forces meaning inward rather than outward. This inward turn produces a wide range of responses. Some people become nihilistic, concluding that nothing matters. Others become fiercely ethical, deciding that meaning must be constructed locally, through care for others and responsibility for shared outcomes. Some cling to belief systems that reinterpret silence as mystery rather than absence. Others oscillate between all of these positions over a lifetime. From an observational perspective, this diversity is telling. The same silence generates radically different internal worlds. That divergence reveals cognitive, cultural, and emotional variation far more clearly than overt instruction ever could. Silence also magnifies disagreement. Without an external authority to settle questions, humans argue among themselves about values, about truth, about what ought to be done. These disagreements sometimes lead to violence, sometimes to compromise, sometimes to fragmentation into separate belief systems that coexist uneasily. Again, from the inside, this feels chaotic. From the outside, it looks like a system testing multiple interpretive frameworks simultaneously. There is a tendency to imagine observers as unified, consistent, perhaps even benevolent or malevolent. But silence does not imply unity. It could just as easily reflect disagreement among observers, or limitations in communication, or an intentional policy of non-interference. From the inside, there is no way to distinguish between these possibilities. Silence collapses them into a single experience. That ambiguity is powerful. It prevents closure. It keeps questions open. It forces humans to operate without certainty about oversight or ultimate judgment. Interestingly, humans recreate this dynamic internally. Parents step back to allow children to make mistakes. Teachers resist giving answers too quickly. Mentors allow struggle to unfold. In each case, silence is used not as neglect, but as space. Space for learning, for adaptation, for self-discovery. But from the learner's perspective, that silence often feels frustrating, unfair, even cruel. Only later does its function become clear, if it ever does. Scale that dynamic up far enough, and the discomfort becomes existential. The long silence of the observers, if they exist, forces humanity to confront its own agency. Without guidance, choices must be owned. Without reassurance, values must be defended internally. Without correction, consequences must be faced collectively. This does not mean humans are abandoned. It means they are unaccompanied in a specific way, free to act, but also free to err. Silence also allows for projection of hope. If observers are silent, they could still be present, watching, waiting, recording. Humans fill the gap with imagination. Sometimes that imagination is comforting. Sometimes it is frightening. Often it is both. Notably, silence does not prevent progress. Science advances without external hints. Ethics evolve through debate and reflection. Art flourishes without cosmic approval. Meaning is built locally, tested socially, revised over time. None of this requires acknowledgement from beyond the system. From an experimental lens, this self-sufficiency would be notable. A system capable of generating complexity, morality, and understanding without external input demonstrates a certain robustness. Whether that robustness leads to sustainability or collapse remains an open question. The silence also filters out dependency. If guidance were obvious, humans might rely on it rather than developing internal frameworks. Silence forces adaptation. It requires humans to become their own observers, critics, and caretakers. This internalization of observation changes behavior. People imagine being watched even when they are not. Conscience forms, social norms solidify, reputation matters. The imagined observer becomes part of the system, shaping actions indirectly. From the inside, this feels like morality, anxiety, accountability. From the outside, it looks like a clever workaround. Observation without presence, influence without interference. The longer the silence persists, the more normalized it becomes. New generations grow up without expecting answers. the question of observers fades into background noise, resurfacing only occasionally, often late at night when routine loosens and curiosity wanders, and yet the silence never fully loses its weight. It lingers as an open space, an unanswered question that refuses to close. Not loud enough to dominate daily life, but present enough to shape it subtly. As attention softens, as the mind stops trying to force meaning from the quiet, the silence can feel less like absence and more like room. Room to think, room to choose, room to be wrong and learn anyway. Free will is usually introduced as a problem, a philosophical obstacle, something that complicates prediction, muddies responsibility, and refuses to fit neatly into equations or models. It is treated as an inconvenience, especially in scientific contexts, because anything that behaves unpredictably is harder to measure, harder to control, and harder to explain. From that perspective, free will looks like a flaw in the system, an error term that refuses to cancel out. But that framing depends entirely on what you think the system is for. From the inside, free will feels like ownership. The sense that your thoughts are yours, your decisions originate within you, and your actions are not merely the output of forces pushing you around. This feeling persists even when you know, intellectually, that biology, environment, and history play enormous roles. You still experience yourself as choosing. Even doubting free will is something that feels chosen. That persistence alone is notable. If humans were designed, selected, or allowed to develop within a framework where behavior was being observed, free will would not be an accidental complication. It would be one of the most informative features available. A system that responds deterministically can be modelled quickly. Once the rules are known, outcomes become boring. A system that includes genuine choice, or at least the experience of choice, remains interesting indefinitely. From an observational standpoint, free will creates variation. It introduces divergence where uniformity might otherwise emerge. Two individuals in nearly identical conditions can make radically different decisions. Small internal differences produce large external consequences. This sensitivity to initial conditions is exactly what makes complex systems worth studying. Humans already recognize this intuitively. When someone says, "I had no choice," it changes how we judge their actions. Responsibility depends on perceived freedom. Moral systems are built around the assumption that people could have done otherwise. Remove that assumption, and praise and blame lose their meaning. If free will were merely a glitch, morality would be an unstable construct. The fact that moral reasoning persists across cultures suggests that the experience of choice is deeply embedded, not incidental. Of course, there is ongoing debate about whether free will exists in any absolute sense. Neuroscience shows that decisions are often preceded by unconscious neural activity. Psychology reveals how easily choices can be influenced by framing, context, and expectation. Social forces nudge behavior in predictable directions. From these findings, some conclude that free will is an illusion, a story the brain tells itself after the fact. But even if that were true at a mechanical level, it would not make free will irrelevant. Illusions can still function. Money is, in many ways, an illusion, yet it organizes enormous amounts of human behavior. Meaning is constructed, yet it motivates sacrifice and cooperation. The question is not whether free will exists independently of physical processes, but whether the system behaves as if it does. From the inside, it clearly does. People deliberate, they hesitate, they regret. They imagine alternative futures and try to steer toward or away from them. These processes take time and mental effort. They are not instantaneous reflexes. They involve weighing values, predicting outcomes, and sometimes acting against immediate impulses. That internal struggle is not noise, it is data. If humans were part of an experiment, free will would allow observers to see how values interact with constraints. Given hunger, some steal, some share, some endure. Given power, some exploit, some protect, some withdraw. Given fear, some flee, some fight, some freeze. The same conditions produce different responses because internal frameworks differ. Those frameworks are shaped by experience, but not determined by it in a simple way. People reinterpret their pasts, they revise their identities, they decide to act differently than they did before, even when patterns suggest they won't. This capacity for self-modification complicates prediction in a way that is deeply informative. From the inside, this feels like growth, or failure, or change. From the outside, it looks like a system capable of updating its own rules. Importantly, free will does not mean unlimited freedom. Humans do not choose their genes, their early environment, or many of the constraints that shape their lives. Choices are always made within boundaries, but those boundaries are rarely so tight that only one action is possible. There is usually some room, however small, to respond differently. That margin is where free will operates. In experimental terms, that margin is gold. It shows how agents behave when given partial freedom. Not total randomness, not total control, but something in between. This middle ground reveals preferences, priorities, and values far more clearly than either extreme. A fully controlled subject tells you nothing about motivation. A fully random one tells you nothing about structure. A partially free subject tells you how structure and agency interact. Humans live almost entirely in this partial space. From the inside, this partiality is frustrating. People want more control than they have. They feel constrained by circumstances, systems, and histories they didn't choose. At the same time, they are overwhelmed by responsibility when choices carry heavy consequences. Free will is both empowering and burdensome. That ambivalence is telling. If free will were a bug, it would likely be suppressed by evolution or system design. Traits that consistently reduce survival or coherence tend not to persist. The fact that the experience of choice remains so central suggests it serves a function. One possible function is adaptability. Systems with free agents can respond creatively to novel situations. When conditions change unexpectedly, rigid rules fail. Flexible decision-making allows for improvisation. Humans demonstrate this constantly, finding workarounds, repurposing tools, inventing solutions that no model could have predicted. From an observer's view, this creativity is invaluable. It shows how intelligence copes with uncertainty, not just by calculating, but by reimagining possibilities. Free will also enables moral experimentation. Humans test norms, challenge traditions, and sometimes reject inherited values entirely. This process is messy and often conflict-ridden, but it allows moral systems to evolve rather than ossify. Societies revise their views on justice, rights, and responsibility through the accumulated choices of individuals willing to act differently. From the inside, these shifts feel like progress or decay, depending on perspective. From the outside, they look like a system exploring ethical space. There is also the matter of responsibility. Free will allows consequences to feed back into behavior. When people believe their choices matter, they pay attention to outcomes. They learn, they adjust. If actions were experienced as inevitable, motivation would erode. Why strive if nothing could be otherwise? The belief in free will sustains engagement with the future. This is especially important in long-term systems. Humans plan for decades, sometimes generations. They invest in education, infrastructure, and institutions whose benefits they may never personally see. This makes little sense without some belief that present choices shape future outcomes. If humans were being observed, this future-oriented behavior would be significant. It shows a system capable of acting beyond immediate self-interest, guided by imagined futures rather than present stimuli. Critically, free will also allows for error. Humans make bad choices, repeatedly. They act against evidence, against advice, against their own stated goals. From the inside, this is often a source of shame or regret. From the outside, it is a source of information. Error reveals priorities. It shows where emotion overrides calculation, where identity outweighs logic, where social belonging matters more than accuracy. These insights cannot be obtained from perfectly rational agents. A system without free will might be efficient, it would not be insightful. There is also the way humans debate free will itself. Entire philosophical traditions are built around questioning it. People argue passionately about whether it exists, whether it matters, and how it should shape ethics and law. This meta-level curiosity, questioning the nature of choice while exercising it, is unusual. From an experimental perspective, a system that questions its own agency is especially rich. It introduces self-reference. The system models itself, then acts on that model, then revises it again. This recursive loop creates depth that cannot be simulated easily. From the inside, this recursion can feel dizzying. Am I choosing this thought, or did it just arise? Does it matter? The question itself is often more unsettling than any answer. But the fact that the question arises at all is informative. Free will also interacts with trust. Humans judge others based on perceived choice. Betrayal hurts because it is seen as chosen. Loyalty matters because it is voluntary. Love is meaningful because it is not coerced. These relational dynamics rely on the assumption of agency. If free will were removed from the system, much of human emotional life would flatten. Relationships would become mechanical. Apologies meaningless. Promises empty. The richness of social bonds depends on the belief that people could act differently and choose not to. From an observer's standpoint, these bonds are among the most complex and revealing features of human behavior. They show how agency is negotiated socially, not just individually. It's also worth noticing how humans attempt to limit free will in certain contexts. Laws restrict choices. Norms discourage deviation. Institutions channel behavior. These constraints are not contradictions of free will but responses to it. They exist because unbounded choice can destabilize systems. The balance between freedom and constraint is dynamic. Societies adjust it constantly, arguing about where limits should lie. These arguments never fully resolve because conditions keep changing. From the inside, this feels political. From the outside, it looks like a system tuning parameters to maintain coherence without eliminating agency. Free will, in this sense, is not an on-off switch. It is a dial. Turn it too far down, and behavior becomes rigid. Turn it too far up, and coordination collapses. Humans operate within a narrow but flexible range, and they constantly negotiate where that range should sit. If this were an experiment, free will would not be an error to correct. It would be the variable that makes the entire system worth observing. Without it, behavior would converge too quickly. With it, outcomes remain open. From the inside, that openness can be exhausting. Uncertainty is tiring. Responsibility weighs heavily. People long for guarantees, for someone else to decide, for relief from choice. At the same time, they resist losing autonomy fiercely. That tension does not resolve, it oscillates. Periods of craving freedom alternate with periods of craving structure. This oscillation shapes history, culture, and personal life alike. Free will can be felt less as a problem to solve and more as a condition to inhabit. Choices will still be made tomorrow, some carefully, some impulsively, some wisely, some not. Whether free will is fundamental or emergent, real or constructed, it operates as if it matters. And systems behave differently when they contain agents who believe their choices count. Suffering, kindness, and choice are usually treated as separate topics. One belongs to ethics, another to psychology, another to philosophy or law. They are discussed in different tones, handled with different tools, and often kept apart to avoid discomfort. But in lived experience, they are rarely separate. They overlap constantly, shaping one another in ways that are difficult to untangle while you are inside them. From the inside, suffering feels immediate. It narrows attention. It pulls awareness inward. When pain, loss, or fear takes hold, abstract questions fall away. Meaning becomes secondary to endurance. Relief becomes the priority. This is not a failure of perspective. It is how nervous systems are built. Suffering demands notice. Kindness, by contrast, often feels optional. It does not force itself into awareness the way suffering does. It can be postponed, diluted, rationalized away. You can always tell yourself you will be kinder later, when things are easier, when you have more time, when you are less tired. Choice sits between these two forces, quietly deciding which direction attention will tilt. From the outside, this triangle is revealing. How a system responds to suffering, whether it generates kindness or indifference, whether choice bends towards self-protection or shared responsibility, tells you something fundamental about how that system operates. Humans already treat suffering as meaningful, even when they cannot explain why it exists. Entire belief systems are built around explaining it, justifying it, redeeming it, or eliminating it. Some frame suffering as a test, others as a consequence, others as random misfortune, others as something to be minimized at all costs. These interpretations shape behavior as much as suffering itself. From the inside, suffering often feels personal, even when it is widely shared. Loss does not feel statistical. Pain does not feel distributed. Each experience carries its own weight, regardless of how many others are carrying similar burdens at the same time. This personal quality is important. It prevents suffering from becoming abstract. It demands response. If humans were part of an experiment, suffering would not be an incidental detail. It would be a central variable, not because it is desirable, but because it provokes reaction. Suffering reveals priorities. It exposes values. It shows what people are willing to do or give up when comfort is removed. Kindness in this context becomes especially significant because it is not guaranteed. Suffering does not automatically produce compassion. Sometimes it produces withdrawal, resentment, or cruelty. Sometimes it produces solidarity. The difference is not trivial. It depends on interpretation, resources, trust, and perceived choice. From the inside, acts of kindness during suffering feel disproportionate. Small gestures take on outsized meaning. A word, a pause, an offer of help can cut through despair in ways that no explanation can. This amplification is not sentimental, it is neurological. In moments of threat, signals of safety and care register deeply. From the outside, these moments look like inflection points. They alter trajectories. They change how individuals and groups respond to future stress. A system where suffering reliably produces mutual aid behaves very differently from one where it reliably produces fragmentation. Choice is what links suffering and kindness without guaranteeing either. Humans do not choose whether suffering exists in the abstract, but they often choose how to respond to it, both their own and that of others. These choices are rarely clear-cut. They are made under pressure, with limited information shaped by fear and fatigue. That messiness is important. If kindness were automatic, it would reveal little. If cruelty were inevitable, it would reveal little. What matters is that humans oscillate between them, sometimes within the same person, sometimes within the same day. From the inside, this oscillation can feel like inconsistency or failure. People judge themselves harshly for not always responding with compassion. They feel guilt when they turn away. They feel resentment when kindness is not reciprocated. These emotional responses add layers of suffering that are not always visible from the outside. From an observational perspective, this complexity is precisely the point. It shows how moral behavior is not a fixed trait, but a dynamic process influenced by context, capacity, and perceived agency. Consider how often people excuse harm by claiming lack of choice. I had no option. I was forced. There was nothing else I could do. Sometimes these claims are true, sometimes they are partial, sometimes they are self-protective narratives. Distinguishing between them is difficult even from the inside, and nearly impossible from the outside. That ambiguity is revealing. It shows how humans navigate responsibility under constraint. how they balance self-preservation against harm to others, how they redraw moral boundaries when circumstances become uncomfortable. If humans were being observed, moments of collective suffering would be especially informative. Wars, pandemics, famines, natural disasters, not because of the suffering itself, but because of the responses they generate. Do people hoard or share? Do institutions protect or exploit? Do narratives emphasize unity or blame? From the inside, these periods feel like crises. From the outside, they look like stress tests. Kindness under stress is costly. It requires energy when energy is scarce. It involves risk when safety is uncertain. That cost makes it meaningful. Low-cost kindness is pleasant. High-cost kindness is revealing. It shows which values persist when incentives reverse. Choice determines whether kindness appears at all in these moments. And choice, under suffering, is constrained. People do not choose from an open field. They choose from narrow corridors shaped by fear, scarcity, and habit. Expecting perfect moral behaviour under these conditions misunderstands how choice actually operates. This misunderstanding often leads to moralising from a distance. Observers judge those in suffering harshly for not acting ideally. From the inside, such judgments feel cruel and detached. They ignore the weight of constraint. An experiment that sought to understand moral behaviour would need to account for this. It would not simply tally acts of kindness or cruelty. It would examine conditions, pressure, information, capacity. It would ask not just what people did, but what options they perceived themselves to have. Perceived choice matters as much as actual choice. Humans act based on what they believe is possible, not on what an external observer might calculate as theoretically available. Two people in similar situations may perceive radically different ranges of action. One sees only survival, another sees room for generosity. Those perceptions shape outcomes. From the inside, perception feels like reality. You cannot choose what you do not see. This is why suffering can narrow moral vision. It collapses time horizons. It prioritizes immediate relief over long-term consequence. Kindness often requires extending attention outward when everything in the body is pulling inward. That extension is not easy. When it happens, it often feels deliberate, even effortful. People describe choosing kindness despite everything. That language is telling. It implies resistance, not instinct. From the outside, this resistance would be notable. It suggests that moral action is not simply conditioned behaviour, but something that sometimes runs counter to immediate self-interest. Choice also determines how suffering is remembered. People construct narratives about what happened to them. They interpret suffering as meaningless or formative, unjust or instructive, isolating or connecting. These narratives influence future behaviour, shaping how individuals respond to others in pain. From the inside, memory softens or sharpens suffering over time. Some wounds heal, others reopen. Some experiences generate empathy, others harden boundaries. These divergent outcomes emerge from similar beginnings, suggesting that interpretation matters as much as experience. Kindness plays a role here as well. Being met with kindness during suffering can reframe the entire event. It can shift identity from victim to survivor, from isolated to supported. Conversely, the absence of kindness can deepen trauma, reinforcing narratives of abandonment or hostility. If humans were the experiment, these narrative shifts would be critical data. They show how meaning is constructed after the fact, how experience is integrated or rejected, how future choices are shaped by past responses. It is tempting to assume that suffering must have a purpose to matter, that it must lead to growth, or enlightenment, or some greater good. This assumption often causes harm. It invalidates pain that does not resolve neatly. It pressures people to find meaning where none is apparent. From an observational standpoint, suffering does not need justification to be informative. Its existence and its effects are enough. How people respond to unjustified suffering reveals more than any tidy explanation ever could. Kindness, similarly, does not need to be heroic to matter. Small, ordinary kindnesses accumulate. They stabilize systems. They build trust incrementally. They reduce the likelihood of future harm by altering expectations. Choice links these accumulations across time. A single choice may seem insignificant. Repeated choices form habits. Shared habits form cultures. Cultures shape institutions. Institutions influence future choices. This cascade is slow, but persistent. From the inside, it is difficult to feel the weight of this process. Individual actions feel small. Impact feels distant. This disconnect can discourage kindness. Why bother if it doesn't change the system? But systems are nothing but accumulated behaviour. From the outside, even small shifts in average behaviour can produce large effects over long periods. The difficulty is that these effects are rarely visible to those making the choices. This invisibility makes kindness a test of values rather than outcomes. People choose it not because it guarantees success, but because it aligns with who they want to be, regardless of recognition. If observers existed, this alignment would be significant. It would show that behaviour is guided not only by reward and punishment, but by internal coherence. Humans act to preserve a sense of self, even when external incentives are weak or absent. Suffering threatens that coherence. It challenges identity. It raises questions about fairness, meaning, and trust. Kindness can restore coherence, not by erasing suffering, but by placing it within a relational context. Choice determines whether that restoration occurs. Importantly, humans also choose cruelty, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through neglect. This too matters. Avoiding this reality does not make it disappear. Cruelty reveals where empathy fails, where fear overwhelms connection, where narratives justify harm. From the inside, cruelty is often rationalized. It is framed as necessary, deserved, or unavoidable. These justifications protect self-image. From the outside, they appear as patterns recurring under similar conditions. An experiment interested in moral behavior would not shy away from these patterns. It would note when cruelty increases, what conditions precede it, and how systems recover or fail to recover afterward. Choice is what makes both kindness and cruelty informative. Without choice, behaviour would be mechanical. With choice, behaviour becomes expressive. As this thought continues, it becomes less about assigning meaning to suffering and more about noticing what suffering makes visible. It strips away comfort. It tests values. It reveals the limits of patience and the depths of care. Kindness, when it appears, does not erase suffering, but it changes what suffering does next. Choice determines whether suffering cascades into further harm or begins to stabilize into something else. There is no need to resolve this, no need to decide whether suffering has a reason, or whether kindness is enough, or whether choice is truly free. The importance lies in how these elements interact, moment by moment, shaping lives from the inside while forming patterns that only become visible with distance. Memory is often treated as a personal possession, something stored privately, shaped by individual experience, accessed at will. You remember your own past, your own mistakes, your own moments of joy or embarrassment, and it feels self-contained. Even when memories involve others, they still seem to belong to you. They live in your mind, change over time, and sometimes surface without warning. But memory does not stay personal for long. From the inside, memory feels fragile. It fades. It distorts. Details slip away or rearrange themselves. Two people can remember the same event differently, and both feel certain they are right. This unreliability is often framed as a flaw, a limitation of the human mind. But from another perspective, it is a feature. Memory is not designed to be a perfect record. It is designed to be useful. Useful for survival, useful for identity, useful for guiding future behaviour. what humans remember and how they remember it, reveals priorities far more clearly than what they experience in the moment. Pain is remembered selectively. Trauma can imprint itself with unbearable clarity, or be buried so deeply it becomes invisible. Success is often polished in hindsight, failure rewritten, memory edits continuously, smoothing some edges and sharpening others. If humans were part of an experiment, memory would be one of the most important internal mechanisms shaping behaviour. Not because it preserves truth, but because it preserves meaning. From the inside, you do not remember everything. You remember what mattered, what hurt, what surprised you, what challenged your sense of self. This selective process determines how you approach the future. Memory narrows possibilities. It also opens them. Records attempt to solve what memory cannot. Writing, art, symbols, numbers, recordings. Humans externalize memory because they know it cannot be trusted to last on its own. Long before modern technology, people marked caves, carved stones, passed down stories. These records outlived individuals. They stabilized knowledge across generations. From the inside, record keeping feels practical, necessary. A way to avoid repeating mistakes, or at least to repeat successes. From the outside, it looks like a system trying to remember itself. Records transform experience into data. They freeze moments that would otherwise dissolve, but in doing so, they also change how those moments are interpreted. A written law feels different from a spoken agreement. A recorded image feels more authoritative than a recollection. A statistic carries weight even when the story behind it is forgotten. This shift has consequences. Humans often trust records more than lived experience, even when records are incomplete or misleading. Numbers feel objective, documents feel official, archives feel permanent, memory feels suspect. If humans were being observed, this preference would be revealing. It shows a system that values stability over fluidity, even at the cost of nuance. Records reduce ambiguity. They create reference points, they anchor meaning, but they also accumulate. Over time, records pile up faster than they can be interpreted. Archives grow, data multiplies. No individual can hold the whole picture. Selection becomes inevitable. Someone decides what is kept, what is discarded, what is highlighted, what is buried. From the inside, this process feels bureaucratic, political, sometimes boring. From the outside, it looks like curation, and curation is never neutral. The question of who is taking notes begins here, not as a cosmic mystery, but as a practical one. Humans are always recording something, but no one records everything. Choices are made constantly about what counts as worth preserving. Those choices shape reality. Consider history. It is often described as a record of what happened. In practice, it is a record of what was noticed, documented, and transmitted. Entire lives vanish without trace. Others are preserved in detail. Power determines visibility. Literacy determines voice. Survival determines whose stories persist. From the inside, this feels unfair but distant. Most people do not expect to be remembered beyond their immediate circles. Memory feels local. Records feel institutional. If observers existed, this unevenness would be significant. It would show how systems prioritize certain narratives over others, how attention shapes reality more than events themselves. Memory also operates collectively. Shared memories form identities. Nations, cultures, families all construct stories about their pasts. These stories are simplified, repeated, ritualized. They provide continuity. They justify present actions. They explain why things are the way they are. From the inside, collective memory feels like truth. It is taught, reinforced, defended. Challenging it feels threatening. From the outside, it looks like a model, one of many possible ways to interpret a complex past. The tension between personal memory and collective record creates friction. Individuals remember experiences that contradict official narratives. These contradictions can remain private, or they can surface, forcing revision. When they do, conflict often follows. If humans were being observed, moments when memory and record clash would be particularly revealing. They show how systems respond to inconsistency. Do they adapt, suppress, reinterpret, ignore? Another layer complicates this further. Technology has changed memory and record keeping dramatically. Digital storage allows unprecedented volumes of data to be preserved. Photos, messages, locations, preferences, things once ephemeral now linger indefinitely. From the inside, this feels both reassuring and unsettling. You can revisit moments easily, but you can also be trapped by them. The past does not fade as it once did. Mistakes persist. Identities harden. Reinvention becomes more difficult when records are permanent. If humans were being observed, this shift would matter. It changes how memory functions. When everything is recorded, memory no longer serves as the primary filter of meaning. Algorithms step in. Attention is guided externally. What resurfaces is not what mattered most, but what is most likely to engage. This raises the question again, in a different form. Who is taking notes now? Is it the individual choosing what to remember? Is it institutions deciding what to archive? Is it automated systems optimizing for retention and reaction? Each produces a different picture of reality. From the inside, this fragmentation is confusing. People feel watched and invisible at the same time. They know data is being collected, but not how it is used. Records exist, but ownership is unclear. Memory becomes external, yet inaccessible. If there were observers beyond the system, they would not need perfect records. Patterns emerge even from partial data. But the way humans record themselves would still be informative. It reveals what they think matters, what they fear losing, what they hope will last. Memory also shapes moral behaviour. People remember harms done to them more vividly than harms they have caused. This asymmetry influences judgment and conflict. Apologies often fail because memories do not align. Records may confirm facts, but they rarely resolve emotional truth. From the inside, this leads to frustration. From the outside, it shows how subjective experience resists standardization. There is also forgetting. Forgetting is often framed as loss, but it is also a function. Without forgetting, memory would overwhelm. Every slight, every fear, every detail would demand attention. Forgetting allows movement. It allows healing. It allows reinterpretation. If humans were part of an experiment, forgetting would be as important as remembering. It determines which patterns persist and which dissolve. It allows systems to reset partially without starting over entirely. Records, by contrast, resist forgetting. They accumulate regardless of relevance. This creates tension. Memory wants to move on. Records insist on recall. From the inside, this tension plays out in debates about forgiveness, accountability, and change. Should past actions define present identity? How long should records matter? When does remembering become punishment? These are not abstract questions. They shape law, relationships, and self-concept. They determine whether people believe change is possible. If observers existed, the answers humans settle on would matter deeply. A system that allows redemption behaves differently from one that enforces permanent identity. Memory and record keeping set the boundaries of transformation. There is also the possibility that no one is taking notes in the way humans imagine. No ledger, no archive, no final report. Observation does not require preservation. Patterns can be noted without storing every detail. Outcomes can be understood without remembering every step. From the inside, this possibility is unsettling. It suggests that individual lives might leave no lasting trace beyond their immediate effects, that nothing is keeping score. For some, this is terrifying. For others, liberating. Humans respond to this uncertainty by creating their own permanence. They build monuments. They write books. They name children after themselves. They upload memories into clouds and servers, hoping something will last. From the outside, this drive toward permanence is striking. It reveals a deep discomfort with impermanence, even when impermanence is a constant feature of existence. Memory also connects directly to identity. You are, in many ways, the story you remember about yourself. Change the story, and identity shifts. Trauma can fracture identity by disrupting narrative continuity. Healing often involves rebuilding memory in a way that restores coherence. If humans were being observed, these identity reconstructions would be fascinating. They show how flexible self-concept can be, even after profound disruption. Records complicate this further. When external records contradict internal narratives, identity tension arises. People feel misunderstood, misrepresented, trapped by versions of themselves they no longer recognize. From the inside, this feels unfair. From the outside, it looks like a system struggling to reconcile static data with dynamic selves. There is also the question of scale again. Individual memories fade quickly, collective records last longer. But even civilizations forget. Languages die, archives decay, data becomes unreadable. Permanence is always temporary on long enough timescales. If observers operate on timescales far beyond human ones, even the most ambitious records would be brief flashes. This raises the possibility that what humans consider lasting may be insignificant from a larger view. But significance does not require duration. A moment can matter without being preserved. An action can shape a system even if it is never recorded explicitly. From the inside, this is hard to accept. Humans equate meaning with remembrance. To be forgotten feels like erasure, but systems are shaped by countless forgotten actions. Most of what matters was never documented. If humans are the experiment, the question of who is taking notes may be less important than how humans behave when they believe notes are being taken, or when they believe they are not. Do people act differently when they think they will be remembered? When they think their actions will be judged later? When they think nothing will last? These beliefs shape behavior profoundly. They influence risk-taking, generosity, honesty, and ambition. From an observational perspective, belief about observation may matter more than observation itself. As attention eases, as the need for permanence loosens slightly, memory can be allowed to do what it does best. Not preserve everything, but preserve enough. Enough to guide, enough to warn, enough to connect. Records will continue to accumulate, selectively, imperfectly. Some things will be lost, some will endure longer than expected. None of this needs resolution. There is a subtle difference between living inside a system and noticing the system while still living inside it. Most of the time, people do the first without ever doing the second. Life unfolds, problems demand attention, routines carry the day forward, and the larger context remains background noise if it appears at all. But occasionally a different kind of thought surfaces. Not loud, not urgent, just persistent enough to linger. A question that does not ask for action, only awareness. What if this is being watched? What if this is not just happening, but being observed? That moment when subjects begin to wonder is not dramatic. It rarely arrives with fear or excitement. More often it comes during pauses, late at night, during repetition, after loss, after learning something that does not quite fit with what was assumed before. The question does not disrupt life immediately. It sits alongside it, quietly altering how things are interpreted. From the inside, this wondering feels personal. It feels like an individual thought, sparked by curiosity or fatigue or boredom. But when many individuals begin to wonder in similar ways, patterns emerge. Questions repeat across cultures and eras, even when answers differ. Someone, somewhere, always asks whether there is more going on than meets the eye. If humans were part of an experiment, this moment of wondering would be significant. Not because it proves anything, but because it marks a shift in awareness. The system begins to model the possibility of observation. That alone can change behaviour, even if no observer ever responds. Humans already demonstrate this effect in smaller contexts. When people believe they might be watched, even abstractly, behaviour shifts. Honesty increases, self-control tightens, norms are followed more closely. This happens even when the watcher is imaginary, symbolic or statistical. The belief is enough. But what happens when the watcher is undefined? When there is no clear rule book, no known expectations, no feedback loop? The result is not uniform compliance, it is divergence. Some people become more cautious, they monitor their actions more closely, they seek alignment between behaviour and values, just in case those values matter beyond immediate outcomes. Others react in the opposite way. They reject the idea entirely, doubling down on autonomy, insisting that nothing external has any claim on their choices. Still others fluctuate, sometimes leaning into the idea, sometimes dismissing it as irrelevant. From the inside, these responses feel like personality differences or philosophical preferences. From the outside, they look like a system testing how awareness of possible observation interacts with free will. Wondering does not produce consensus. It produces fragmentation. New belief systems form. Old ones are revised. Some people find comfort in the idea of being observed. It reassures them that existence is not random, that suffering might be seen, that actions might matter in ways not immediately visible. Others find the same idea oppressive, threatening autonomy and privacy at the deepest level. This split is telling. It shows that the meaning of observation is not inherent. It is interpreted through existing values, fears, and hopes. When subjects begin to wonder, they also begin to tell stories. Not necessarily elaborate ones. Sometimes just small narratives that frame experience differently. A coincidence becomes suggestive. A pattern feels intentional. Silence takes on weight. These stories are not evidence. They are coping mechanisms, ways to integrate uncertainty into a coherent worldview. From the inside, storytelling feels natural. Humans have always done it. Stories organize experience. They make chaos navigable. But when the story involves possible observation, the stakes feel higher. The narrative touches identity, morality, and purpose. If humans are the experiment, this narrative generation would be one of the richest sources of information. It reveals how intelligence responds when confronted with uncertainty about its own context. Does it become paranoid, hopeful, creative, nihilistic, ethical? None of these responses are trivial. They shape behaviour in concrete ways. Consider how morality shifts when people believe they are observed versus when they believe they are alone. Some behave better, some feel resentful, some feel relieved. The difference lies not in the presence of rules, but in the interpretation of oversight. Is the observer seen as judge, witness, recorder, or irrelevant bystander? Because there is no confirmation, interpretations proliferate. This proliferation is destabilizing in the short term. People argue. They disagree about what matters. They accuse one another of naivety or cynicism. But in the long term, it increases the range of responses available to the system. Diversity of interpretation leads to diversity of behavior. From an experimental perspective, this is valuable. A system that converges too quickly on a single explanation loses informational richness. A system that tolerates multiple interpretations remains dynamic. Wondering also shifts attention inward. People begin to examine their own motivations more closely. If someone might be watching, why do I do what I do? Am I acting out of habit, fear, desire, or principle? Even if the observer is imaginary, the self-examination is real. This introspection can be uncomfortable. It exposes inconsistencies. People notice gaps between stated values and actual behaviour. They experience guilt or resolve or confusion. Again, from the inside, this feels like personal struggle. From the outside, it looks like a system refining its internal models. Importantly, wondering does not require belief. You can wonder without accepting any conclusion. That liminal state between belief and dismissal is particularly interesting. It sustains curiosity without closure. It keeps the question alive without letting it dominate. Many people live most of their lives in this state. They do not commit to a worldview that includes observers, nor do they rule it out entirely. They carry the question lightly, letting it surface occasionally, then recede. From the inside, this feels reasonable. From the outside, it shows how humans manage uncertainty pragmatically. They do not need answers to function. They need workable assumptions. Wondering also changes how people relate to time. If actions might be observed or recorded beyond immediate consequences, present moments feel connected to a larger arc. People think about legacy, impact, what remains after they're gone. Even those who reject the idea of observers often care deeply about being remembered by others, by history, by future generations. This concern shapes behaviour. People build, write, teach, mentor. They invest in systems that outlast them. They care about reputation. They argue about how history will judge them. These concerns persist even when no external observer is assumed, suggesting that the idea of being noticed is deeply ingrained. If observers existed, they would not need to intervene. The mere possibility would be enough to alter trajectories. There is also resistance. Some people respond to wondering with defiance. If someone is watching, they think, then I will not perform. I will act according to my own rules. This resistance itself is a form of engagement. It acknowledges the possibility even as it rejects its authority. From the inside, defiance feels like freedom. From the outside, it looks like another data point, another mode of response. Wondering also interacts with power. Those with less power often feel watched already. Surveillance, judgment, scrutiny are part of daily life. For them, the idea of observers does not feel abstract. It feels familiar, even oppressive. Those with more power often feel invisible. Their actions go unquestioned. For them, the idea of observers can feel novel or even amusing. These differences shape responses dramatically. Wondering does not occur in a vacuum. It is filtered through lived experience. If humans are the experiment, this uneven distribution of perceived observation would matter. It shows how awareness of being watched interacts with inequality, how scrutiny changes behaviour differently depending on who bears its weight. There is also the question of scale again. Wondering at the individual level feels introspective. At the collective level, it becomes cultural. Entire societies develop narratives about observation. Gods, ancestors, algorithms, history itself become watchers. These constructs guide behaviour long after their origins are forgotten. From the inside, these systems feel normal. They are taught, inherited, institutionalized. From the outside, they look like self-generated regulatory mechanisms. Wondering, then, is not just a thought. It is a catalyst. It initiates feedback loops between belief, behaviour, and structure. It does not need resolution to have effect. It is also fragile. Under constant stress, wondering fades. Survival crowds it out. Under excessive certainty, it dissolves. Answers, even false ones, close the question. Wondering thrives in moderate conditions, where basic needs are met and uncertainty remains tolerable. This suggests that wondering is context-dependent. It emerges when there's enough safety to think, but enough ambiguity to motivate questioning. That balance is rare, but not accidental. From an observational standpoint, moments when wondering spikes would be notable. Periods of relative stability punctuated by existential questioning. Times when technological or scientific shifts destabilize old frameworks, reopening questions that seemed settled. From the inside, these periods feel disorienting. Old answers no longer suffice. New ones are not yet trusted. People oscillate between nostalgia and speculation. Wondering also influences how people treat each other. If actions might be seen, kindness may increase, or hypocrisy may deepen, or cynicism may spread. The effect is not uniform. It depends on whether observation is framed as compassionate, judgmental, indifferent, or irrelevant. Because there is no confirmation, humans project their own values onto the imagined observer. A kind person imagines a kind watcher. A punitive person imagines a punitive one. A skeptical person imagines none at all. These projections reinforce existing traits. If observers existed, they would not need to reveal themselves to learn a great deal. They would only need to notice how humans imagine them. Wondering also interacts with creativity. Artists, writers, thinkers often address an unseen audience. They speak to someone who may never respond. This imagined audience shapes expression. It refines ideas. It motivates completion. From the inside, this feels like communication. From the outside, it looks like a system rehearsing its own understanding, broadcasting without expecting reply. Importantly, wondering does not last forever in any one person. It waxes and wanes. People drift in and out of it. Some revisit it repeatedly. Others encounter it once and move on. There is no stable state of constant questioning. This impermanence is itself informative. It shows how cognitive resources are allocated. Wondering competes with urgency, fatigue, pleasure, and distraction. It survives only when conditions allow. As attention begins to soften, as the mind tires of holding the question actively, wondering can settle into the background. It does not disappear. It becomes implicit, a quiet awareness that context might be larger than assumed, without demanding focus. That quiet state is perhaps the most natural one. Life continues. Choices are made. Suffering and kindness still matter. Memory and record still shape behaviour. The question of observers lingers without pressing. At some point, after enough wondering, another question begins to form, quieter than the first, but heavier in a different way. Not whether there are observers, not whether this is an experiment, but whether it is even meant to be discovered at all, whether the act of uncovering some hidden framework is the goal, or whether living inside it without certainty is the point. From the inside, discovery feels important. Humans are builders of explanations. When something seems incomplete, the instinct is to finish it. Loose ends create tension. Unanswered questions feel like unfinished tasks. This is true in science, in relationships, in personal identity. People want to know how things work, why they happened, what they mean. Discovery offers relief. It promises closure. But experience does not behave that way. Experience unfolds whether it is understood or not. Pain hurts before it is explained. Joy arrives without waiting for interpretation. Love, fear, boredom, curiosity, fatigue, all occur first and make sense later, if they ever do. Much of life happens too quickly, or too deeply, to be processed in real time. Understanding trails behind, trying to catch up. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. That understanding may not be the central function of existence. That explanation may be optional, secondary, or even incidental. If humans were part of an experiment, discovery would not necessarily be built into the design. Many experiments do not require subjects to understand what is being studied. In fact, understanding can interfere. Once subjects know the purpose, they alter behaviour, consciously or unconsciously. Experience becomes performance. From the inside, performance feels different from living. It introduces self-consciousness. It narrows spontaneity. It replaces authenticity with strategy. People begin acting not according to internal motivation, but according to what they think is expected. If the goal were to observe genuine behaviour, discovery would be counterproductive. This does not mean discovery is forbidden or dangerous. It means it may not be central. Humans often assume that if something can be known, it should be known. That knowledge is always an improvement. But that assumption comes from within the system. It reflects human values, not necessarily the values of whatever context the system exists within. Experience does not require explanation to be real. From the inside, there is a difference between understanding something intellectually and having lived through it. You can read about grief endlessly and still be unprepared when it arrives. You can study kindness and still struggle to offer it under pressure. Experience resists abstraction. It demands presence. If the purpose of a system were experiential rather than informational, then discovery would be optional, not irrelevant but not required. Understanding could emerge locally, piecemeal, without ever resolving into a final answer. Humans already live this way in many domains. You do not fully understand consciousness to be conscious. You do not fully understand time to feel it passing. You do not fully understand meaning to care about something deeply. Experience leads, explanation follows, imperfectly. This suggests that the urge to discover may be a feature of human cognition rather than a requirement of the system itself. When people ask whether they are meant to discover the truth of their existence, they often assume that truth is singular, stable, and external, something waiting to be found. But lived truth behaves differently. It shifts with context. It changes with perspective. It grows and contracts over time. From the inside, this fluidity can feel unsatisfying. People want firm ground. They want answers that do not move. But experience is not fixed. It is ongoing. Any answer frozen in time risks becoming outdated the moment conditions change. If discovery were the goal, one might expect clearer signals, clues that accumulate toward a conclusion, a sense of progress toward revelation. Instead, what humans encounter is ambiguity that persists across centuries. Questions recur rather than resolve. Each answer opens new uncertainties. This pattern suggests that discovery may not be convergent. It may not point toward a single endpoint. Experience, by contrast, does not need to converge. It can expand indefinitely. Each moment is complete in itself, even as it contributes to something larger. From an observational standpoint, this distinction matters. A system optimized for discovery would reward insight, accelerate clarity, reduce ambiguity. A system optimized for experience would tolerate confusion, allow contradiction, and prioritize depth over resolution. Earth, as it is lived, leans heavily toward the latter. People often discover too late. Understanding arrives after consequences have unfolded. Wisdom follows loss. Clarity comes with hindsight. This delay is frustrating from the inside, but revealing from the outside. It shows that behavior is shaped more by experience than by foresight. If humans were meant to discover the nature of their situation, one might expect that discovery to arrive before irreversible choices are made. Instead, humans often act first, then understand later. Sometimes much later. This sequencing suggests that experience is primary. There is also the way discovery can flatten experience. Once something is explained, it loses mystery. That can be empowering, but it can also be numbing. Familiarity dulls attention. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. People stop noticing what once felt alive. Experience thrives on immediacy. Discovery often replaces immediacy with categorization. Humans oscillate between these modes. They seek understanding, then long for wonder again. They explain, then romanticize. They demystify, then feel something missing. If this were an experiment, that oscillation would be telling. It would show a system torn between wanting to know and wanting to feel, between mastery and immersion. Some experiences resist discovery entirely. Love, for example, can be analysed endlessly without being exhausted. You can map hormones, attachment styles, social patterns, and still miss what it feels like to care for someone deeply. The explanation does not replace the experience. It runs alongside it, incomplete. Suffering behaves similarly. You can identify causes, mechanisms, probabilities, and still be overwhelmed when it happens to you. Explanation does not reduce impact. Experience remains primary. If humans were meant to discover something fundamental, one might expect experience to align more closely with explanation. Instead, they remain partially decoupled. Understanding rarely grants immunity. This decoupling suggests that explanation is not the lever that moves the system. There is also the question of accessibility. Discovery tends to concentrate among those with resources, education, and time. Experience is universal. Everyone suffers. Everyone chooses. Everyone encounters kindness or its absence. If meaning were tied to discovery, it would be unevenly distributed. If meaning were tied to experience, it would be shared. Humans often struggle with this tension. They elevate knowledge while claiming that lived experience matters. They privilege expertise while insisting that everyone's perspective counts. These contradictions reflect an unresolved question about what truly matters. From the inside, this feels like debate. From the outside, it looks like a system negotiating its values. If discovery were essential, failure to discover would be catastrophic. Ignorance would doom the system, but ignorance persists without collapse. Humans misunderstand reality constantly and still continue. They hold false beliefs, incomplete models, conflicting narratives, and life goes on. This resilience suggests that correctness is not the sole driver of viability. Experience, by contrast, cannot be skipped. You cannot opt out of having moments. Even distraction is an experience. Even avoidance shapes what happens next. Whether or not you understand what is happening, it still affects you. If observers existed, they would not need subjects to discover the nature of the experiment to gather information. In fact, discovery might contaminate the data. Experience, unfiltered by certainty, would be more valuable. This does not mean curiosity is misplaced. Curiosity enriches experience. It deepens engagement. It motivates exploration. But it does not need to culminate in final answers to serve its function. Curiosity can exist without resolution. From the inside, this is difficult to accept. People equate curiosity with progress. They expect questions to lead somewhere. To stop short feels like failure, but curiosity can also be a mode of attention rather than a path to closure. Attending to life as it unfolds, without demanding explanation, is a form of curiosity. It is quieter, less ambitious, but no less real. There is also the issue of timing. Perhaps discovery is not meant to happen yet, or not meant to happen all at once, or not meant to happen consciously. Humans often assume that if something is to be known, it will be known explicitly, articulated clearly, documented and shared. But many systems encode information implicitly, through patterns, through constraints, through tendencies that shape outcomes without ever being named. Humans already operate within such systems. Language, culture, and norms guide behavior without requiring constant awareness. If there is something to be discovered, it may not arrive as a revelation. It may arrive as a gradual shift in behavior, a slow recalibration of values, a change in how people relate to one another. Discovery without declaration. From the inside, such changes feel organic. They do not announce themselves as breakthroughs. They feel like drifting, adapting, responding. This raises the possibility that the question itself is misframed. Not are we meant to discover this, but what does discovery look like in a system like this? If discovery is defined as certainty, then perhaps it is not intended. If discovery is defined as increased coherence between experience and values, then perhaps it is already happening quietly. Humans often discover things not by solving them, but by living with them long enough that their responses change. You do not solve aging, you adjust to it. You do not solve loss, you integrate it. You do not solve uncertainty, you learn how to function within it. From the inside, these adjustments feel like maturity, or resignation, or wisdom, depending on mood. From the outside, they look like adaptation. If humans were part of an experiment, adaptation would matter more than explanation. How does a system behave over time, not whether it understands itself perfectly? There is also the danger of discovery becoming an escape from experience. People chase answers to avoid feeling. They intellectualize to distance themselves from pain. They seek frameworks to make suffering tolerable. While this can be helpful, it can also prevent engagement with the present moment. Experience, when avoided, does not disappear. It accumulates. It resurfaces in unexpected ways. If discovery were the goal, avoidance might be rewarded. If experience were the goal, avoidance would distort outcomes. Humans show both tendencies. They pursue understanding and they avoid feeling. They oscillate. This oscillation is revealing. It shows that neither mode fully satisfies on its own. Perhaps the most telling detail is that even those who believe discovery is impossible still care deeply about how they live. They still make moral choices. They still value kindness. They still seek connection. They still experience regret and hope. These behaviors persist regardless of metaphysical conclusions. That persistence suggests that meaning does not depend on discovery. It depends on participation. As attention begins to slow, as the urgency to answer gives way to the simplicity of being present, the question softens. Not am I supposed to know, but what is happening right now? How am I responding? What choices am I making in the absence of certainty? Experience does not wait for permission. If discovery comes, it will come on its own terms, shaped by conditions beyond individual control. If it does not, experience will still unfold, moment by moment, carrying weight whether or not it is explained. There is a particular comfort in imagining that things eventually conclude, that questions resolve, that processes finish, that effort accumulates toward a recognizable endpoint. Humans are deeply oriented toward results. Projects are completed. Stories end. Lives are measured by beginnings, middles, and conclusions. Even rest is framed as preparation for what comes next. This structure helps the mind organize time and effort. Without it, attention drifts, motivation weakens, and meaning becomes harder to pin down. So when the idea arises that there may be no final result at all, it tends to provoke quiet resistance. Not panic necessarily. More a subtle discomfort, a sense that something essential is missing. If there is no endpoint, what is all of this for? From the inside, this question feels practical as much as philosophical. People plan their lives around outcomes. Education leads to careers. Careers lead to stability or recognition. Relationships lead somewhere. Growth implies direction. Even suffering is often endured with the hope that it will lead to resolution, improvement, or understanding. The promise of a result makes endurance tolerable. But many processes humans live inside do not behave that way. Biological evolution does not aim for a final form. It adapts endlessly, responding to shifting conditions without any concept of completion. Ecosystems do not stabilize permanently. They fluctuate, collapse, regenerate, and transform. Weather does not move toward an ideal state. It cycles. Even individual development does not resolve cleanly. People grow, adapt, regress, change direction, revisit old patterns. There is no point at which a person is finished. From the outside, these systems are not broken. They are functioning exactly as they are structured to function. The expectation of a final result may be a human projection, rather than a universal principle. If humans were part of an experiment, the assumption that there must be a conclusion would reflect human habits of thought, not necessarily the logic of observation. Many experiments do not end because they have reached a definitive answer. They end because resources run out, interest shifts, or conditions change. Some are left open indefinitely, continuing to produce data without closure. From the inside, living inside such an open-ended process feels unfinished. From the outside, it looks complete in every moment. This difference in perspective matters. Consider how humans evaluate success. Something is successful if it achieves its goal, but goals are often assigned retroactively. A process unfolds, and then humans decide what it was for. History is full of examples where actions taken for one reason produce outcomes that are later framed as the real purpose all along. This retroactive framing creates the illusion of direction. It makes outcomes feel intentional even when they emerged unpredictably. If there were no final result, this habit would persist. Humans would continue assigning meaning to phases, interpreting transitions as progress or failure, even if the system itself had no preference. From the inside, this meaning-making is not optional. It is how humans cope with uncertainty. Without narrative, experience feels chaotic. With narrative, even randomness can be tolerated. But narrative does not require an ending to function. It requires continuity. Experience supplies that continuity moment by moment. If there is no final result, then meaning cannot be deferred. It cannot be postponed until completion. It must be generated locally in present conditions without reference to a finish line that may never appear. This idea is unsettling because it removes the promise of eventual resolution. Suffering may not be redeemed. Effort may not culminate. Questions may remain open, but it also removes the pressure to justify the present solely by the future. From the inside, many people already live this way without naming it. They find meaning in daily routines, in relationships, in small acts that do not accumulate toward anything grand. They care for others knowing that care does not solve existence. They work knowing that work will never be done. They rest knowing that fatigue will return. These behaviors persist because meaning does not actually require finality. It requires engagement. If humans were being observed, this persistence would be significant. It would show that agents continue to act even when outcomes are uncertain or impermanent. That motivation does not collapse in the absence of ultimate resolution. In fact, the belief in a final result can sometimes distort behavior. When people become fixated on outcomes, they may sacrifice present well-being, ethics, or attention in pursuit of an imagined endpoint. History offers many examples of harm justified by promised futures that never arrived. If there is no final result, such sacrifices lose their justification. From the inside, this realization can feel destabilizing. People worry that without an endpoint, effort becomes meaningless. But meaning does not vanish. It relocates. It shifts from outcome to process. Process-oriented meaning values how things are done rather than what they produce. It emphasizes care, integrity, responsiveness. It allows actions to matter even if they do not lead anywhere permanent. Humans already operate this way in many domains. Friendship does not aim to conclude. It aims to continue. Parenting does not end in completion. It transforms. Learning does not finish. It deepens or changes focus. Even sleep is not an endpoint. It is a cycle. The expectation of finality may be an artifact of limited lifespan. Because individual lives end, humans project endings onto everything. But systems larger than the individuals do not share this constraint. If humans are part of such a system, the absence of a final result would be natural. From an observational standpoint, a system without an endpoint allows for richer data. There is no rush to judgment. No need to collapse complexity into conclusions. Patterns can be observed across phases without assuming that later stages are superior to earlier ones. This perspective challenges linear narratives of progress. Humans often assume that newer is better, that later stages represent improvement. But systems can become more complex without becoming better. They can gain power without gaining wisdom. They can accelerate without stabilizing. If there is no final result, progress becomes contextual rather than absolute. Changes are evaluated based on local effects rather than alignment with a distant goal. From the inside, this requires humility. It undermines grand narratives. It suggests that certainty about direction may be misplaced, but it also relieves pressure. If there is no finish line, then falling behind is less meaningful. Comparison loses some of its sting. Pace becomes personal rather than competitive. This does not eliminate ambition or effort. It reframes them. People still strive, but not necessarily toward permanence. They strive toward alignment with values, toward reducing harm, toward increasing understanding, even if those efforts do not culminate. If humans were the experiment, this reframing would matter. It would show whether agents can sustain motivation without promised closure, whether care persists when reward is uncertain, whether systems stabilise through local meaning rather than global resolution. There is also the question of evaluation. Experiments with final results are judged by outcomes. Experiments without final results are judged by dynamics, how things change, not where they end. Humans are not particularly comfortable with this mode of evaluation. It resists simple metrics. It requires patience. It tolerates ambiguity. It values resilience over achievement. From the inside, living without a final result can feel like drifting. But drifting is not necessarily aimless. It can be responsive. It can be attentive. It can allow for adjustment rather than rigid adherence to a plan. Nature operates this way constantly. Rivers do not aim to finish. They flow. They change course. They erode and deposit. Their paths respond to terrain. Their meaning is not in arriving, but in shaping landscapes as they move. Human lives, at a different scale, share this quality. If they were observers, they might not be interested in conclusions at all. They might be interested in whether the system remains viable, whether it adapts, whether it avoids collapse or recovers from it, whether it generates novelty without destroying itself. These are not questions that have final answers. They are ongoing conditions. From the inside, collapse feels catastrophic. From the outside, it may appear as one phase among many. This difference in perspective does not diminish suffering, but it does change how permanence is understood. Another implication of no final result is that there is no final judgment, no ultimate scorecard, no moment where everything is weighed and resolved. For some, this is frightening. It removes the hope that injustices will be balanced eventually, that wrongs will be corrected definitively. For others, it is freeing. It removes the fear of eternal evaluation. It allows mistakes to be finite rather than absolute. Humans oscillate between these responses. They desire justice and mercy, accountability and forgiveness. Finality promises clarity, but it also promises rigidity. Without a final result, justice becomes ongoing work rather than ultimate settlement. Repair replaces verdict. Responsibility becomes continuous rather than terminal. From the inside, this is exhausting. It requires sustained effort. There is no moment where one can say it is finished, but it also allows for revision, for learning, for change. If humans were part of an experiment without a final result, this continuous ethical negotiation would be central. It would show how agents manage responsibility without definitive closure. There is also the matter of boredom. Systems without endpoints risk stagnation if novelty fades. Humans are particularly sensitive to this. When repetition sets in without perceived progress, disengagement follows. But humans also generate novelty internally. Curiosity, creativity, conflict, cooperation. These forces introduce variation even in stable conditions. The absence of a final result does not imply stasis. From the inside, boredom often signals misalignment rather than meaninglessness. It indicates that attention is not being engaged, that conditions are too predictable or too constrained. If observers existed, boredom would be a signal. It would indicate that the system has exhausted a particular configuration and may need to shift. Humans respond to boredom in varied ways. Some seek stimulation, others seek depth, some withdraw, others disrupt. These responses shape trajectories. Again, no final result is required for behaviour to matter. There is also the question of death. Individual endings complicate the idea of no final result. From the inside, death feels definitive. It marks a clear boundary. But systems incorporate death without concluding. Individuals exit. Patterns persist. New agents enter. This turnover is not an error. It is a mechanism. It allows change without erasing continuity. If humans were the experiment, individual deaths would not signal completion. They would signal iteration. From the inside, this can feel cold. It seems to reduce lives to replaceable units, but lived experience remains singular. Each life matters to itself and to those it touches, regardless of how the system absorbs its absence. Meaning does not require permanence to be real. A conversation matters even though it ends. A song matters even though it fades. Sleep matters even though wakefulness returns. If there is no final result, then the value of moments is not derived from their contribution to an ending. It is derived from their internal qualities and their immediate effects. This perspective aligns with how humans actually experience life, even if they resist acknowledging it. Most moments are lived without reference to ultimate outcomes. People eat, talk, rest, work, laugh, worry. They do not constantly orient themselves toward a final conclusion. They live locally. The idea of a final result often arises in reflection, not in action. From the inside, then, the absence of a final result may be less disruptive than it appears. It challenges narratives more than behaviour. If humans were being observed, the question would not be whether they reach an endpoint, but whether they sustain coherence, care, and curiosity without one. As attention begins to slow, as the pressure to resolve loosens, the possibility of no final result can feel less threatening. It becomes another condition, like uncertainty, limitation, or time, something to operate within rather than escape from. If an experiment never ends, it stops being something you wait to finish and becomes something you live inside without reference to completion. That shift is subtle, but it changes how every other question is framed. There is no point at which results are compiled, no moment where outcomes are judged against expectations, no closing phase where everything is summed up and explained. There is only continuation, adjustment, response, change layered on top of change. From the inside, this idea initially feels heavy. Humans are accustomed to thinking in terms of phases and conclusions. Even when something is ongoing, it is usually broken into segments. Projects end. Relationships change form. Days conclude with sleep. The sense that something will eventually stop provides psychological relief. It allows effort to feel contained. So the suggestion that the experiment never ends can sound exhausting, as if it implies endless scrutiny or infinite obligation. But that reaction comes from imagining the experiment as something imposed rather than something indistinguishable from existence itself. If it never ends, then it is not something extra added onto life. It is simply life continuing. In human terms, many systems already operate this way. There is no final version of culture, no completed form of society, no ultimate state of understanding. Each generation inherits conditions shaped by the previous one, modifies them, and passes them on. Problems are not solved once and for all. They are managed, displaced, transformed. Solutions introduce new challenges. Stability is temporary. Change is constant. From the inside, this feels frustrating. People want closure. They want to believe that effort accumulates toward resolution. That if enough progress is made, certain questions will no longer need to be asked. And yet, the same themes recur. Inequality, conflict, cooperation, curiosity, fear, care. They reappear in different forms, shaped by new contexts but recognizable in outline. If the experiment never ends, this repetition is not failure. It is the point. An endless experiment does not aim to reach a correct state. It aims to observe how states emerge, dissolve, and re-emerge under changing conditions. It is interested in dynamics, not destinations. From an external perspective, an endpoint would be arbitrary. Why stop at one configuration rather than another? Why declare completion when the system is still capable of generating new behaviour? Humans often assume that learning culminates in mastery, but many forms of learning do not behave that way. You do not master relationships. You participate in them. You do not master health. You manage it temporarily. You do not master meaning. You negotiate it repeatedly as circumstances shift. An experiment that never ends mirrors this structure. From the inside, living without an endpoint changes how responsibility feels. If there is no final evaluation, then responsibility is not about passing or failing. It is about participation. How you act matters not because it will be judged later, but because it shapes what comes next. This reframing is subtle but important. It moves ethics away from scorekeeping and towards stewardship. Actions are not weighed against an ultimate ledger. They are assessed by their immediate and downstream effects. Humans already operate this way in practice, even if they talk differently. People rarely act because they expect cosmic judgment. They act because they care about outcomes they can imagine. Harm that is visible matters more than harm that is abstract. Kindness that is felt matters more than kindness that is hypothetical. If the experiment never ends, this local focus makes sense. There is no final balancing of scales. There is only ongoing influence. This also changes how failure is understood. In systems with endpoints, failure is terminal. You did not achieve the goal, you're done. In systems without endpoints, failure is information. It alters future behavior. It shapes adaptation. From the inside, failure still hurts. Loss still stings. Mistakes still carry consequences, but they do not disqualify participation. There is no elimination round. You continue, changed. This continuity allows learning without finality. It allows recovery without erasure. It allows error without collapse, at least until errors accumulate beyond the system's capacity to absorb them. If humans were part of such an experiment, collapse would not be failure in a moral sense. It would be a transition, a reconfiguration, possibly a reset at some scale, though not necessarily a complete one. From the inside, collapse feels like the end of the world. From the outside, it may look like a phase shift. This difference in perspective does not make collapse acceptable, it makes it intelligible. An experiment that never ends also reframes the idea of progress. Progress is no longer movement toward completion. It becomes movement toward different configurations, some more stable, some more fragile, some more humane, some more efficient. Humans tend to equate progress with improvement, but improvement depends on values, and values shift. What one era considers progress, another may consider loss. This does not mean progress is meaningless. It means it is contextual. In an endless experiment, progress would be evaluated relative to local conditions rather than absolute goals. Does this configuration reduce suffering compared to the previous one? Does it increase resilience? Does it allow more flexibility? These are questions without final answers, but with ongoing relevance. From the inside, this requires patience. It undermines the desire for definitive victories. It encourages incremental change rather than grand resolution. Another implication of no ending is that observation does not accumulate toward judgment. There is no moment where the data is complete. Patterns are always provisional. Interpretations remain open. Humans are not comfortable with provisional conclusions. They prefer certainty. They want to know where they stand. But systems that never end cannot offer final certainty without freezing themselves. If observers existed, they would not need to decide what humans are for. They would only need to continue watching how humans adapt, cooperate, conflict, and reimagine themselves. This removes a certain pressure. If there is no final result, then humans are not being tested to pass or fail. They are being observed as they are. That observation does not require approval or disapproval. From the inside, this idea can be calming. It removes the sense of being evaluated against an unknown standard. It allows life to be lived without trying to satisfy an invisible rubric. At the same time, it removes the reassurance that everything will be settled eventually, that injustice will be corrected, that suffering will be redeemed. Without an endpoint, these outcomes are not guaranteed. Instead, justice becomes something that must be continuously pursued. Care must be renewed. Repair must be ongoing. There is no final state where these efforts are no longer necessary. Humans already live with this reality, even if they resist naming it. Social progress requires maintenance. Rights can erode. Trust can decay. Gains can be reversed. Nothing is permanently secured. From the inside, this fragility feels discouraging. It creates fatigue. People long for permanence, but permanence is rare in complex systems. An endless experiment does not promise permanence. It promises continuity. Continuity does not mean sameness. It means that change happens without closure, that new generations enter conditions shaped by previous ones, that memory and forgetting coexist, that innovation and tradition interact. If the experiment never ends, then discovery, if it occurs, would not be a final revelation. It would be a local insight useful for a time, then revised. Knowledge would remain provisional. This is already how science operates. Theories are refined, replaced, expanded. There is no final theory of everything that ends inquiry. Each answer opens new questions. Humans accept this intellectually, but often resist it emotionally. They want something solid to stand on. An endless experiment offers no such foundation. Instead, it offers adaptability as the primary skill. From the inside, adaptability is not always experienced as strength. It can feel like instability, like never being settled. But adaptability is what allows systems to persist without breaking under change. If humans were the experiment, adaptability would be one of the most important traits observed. Not just biological adaptability, but psychological and social adaptability. How do values shift under pressure? How do identities change? How do institutions respond to stress? An endless experiment allows these questions to be explored repeatedly, under varied conditions, without needing to reach a conclusion. There is also the matter of attention. In an experiment with an endpoint, attention builds toward the finish. In an endless experiment, attention must be sustained differently. Peaks and lulls alternate. Periods of intense focus give way to routine. Interest waxes and wanes. Humans already show this rhythm. They mobilize around crises, then relax. They innovate rapidly, then consolidate. They question deeply, then return to habit. From the inside, this feels natural. From the outside, it looks like oscillation. An endless experiment accommodates oscillation. It does not require constant engagement. It allows disengagement without termination. This has implications for meaning. Meaning does not need to be constantly reinforced. It can fade and return. It can be quiet or intense. It can be personal or shared. If there is no end, meaning cannot be stockpiled. It must be regenerated. Humans already regenerate meaning through relationships, creativity, care, and curiosity. They do not rely on ultimate answers to sustain these processes. They rely on presence. An endless experiment would not require humans to believe in it. It would not need acknowledgement. It would continue regardless of awareness. The question of whether it ever ends would matter less than how humans behave under the assumption that it does or does not. Those who believe in an ending may act urgently, sometimes destructively. Those who believe there is no ending may act conservatively, or become complacent. Others may ignore the question entirely and focus on immediate concerns. These differences would be informative. They show how beliefs about finality shape behavior. If the experiment never ends, then belief in endings becomes another variable. Some humans orient toward apocalypse, others toward continuity, some toward transcendence, others toward maintenance. None of these orientations are neutral. They influence policy, ethics, risk tolerance, and care for the future. From the inside, these beliefs feel deeply personal. From the outside, they look like strategies. An endless experiment would also blur the line between subject and system. Humans would not be separate from the environment being observed. They would be part of it, modifying conditions even as they are shaped by them. This mutual influence complicates any notion of control. There is no external hand steering toward an outcome. There is feedback, adaptation, emergence. If observers existed, they would not be directing the experiment. They would be witnessing self-organization. This reframes power. There is no central authority imposing meaning. Meaning arises from interaction. From the inside, this can feel disorienting. People often want guidance. They want to know what to do. In an endless experiment, there is no final instruction. There is only response. Response to suffering. Response to change. Response to uncertainty. Response to one another. If the experiment never ends, then rest becomes especially important. Without endpoints, exhaustion accumulates. Systems need cycles of disengagement. Sleep becomes essential, not just biologically, but psychologically. Humans already rely on sleep to reset attention, regulate emotion, and restore capacity. In an endless process, rest is not a pause before the end. It is part of continuation. From the inside, sleep feels like escape. From the outside, it is maintenance. An endless experiment would not demand constant vigilance. It would allow for forgetting, distraction, and renewal. Without these, the system would burn out. There is also the matter of hope. Hope often depends on future resolution. If there is no final result, what becomes of hope? Hope shifts. It becomes less about arrival and more about direction, less about completion and more about improvement, less about certainty and more about possibility. Humans already practice this form of hope in many contexts. They hope for better days without expecting perfection. They hope for relief without guarantees. They hope for connection without permanence. This hope is quieter, but more sustainable. If the experiment never ends, hope would not be pinned to an ending. It would be renewed continually, or abandoned and rediscovered as conditions change. From the inside, this feels fragile. But fragility is not failure, it is sensitivity. As attention begins to slow, as the weight of these ideas softens, the notion of an endless experiment can begin to feel less threatening. Not infinite labour, not eternal judgment, just ongoing unfolding. No final report, no conclusion slide, no summary, just continuation. At some point, questions stop asking to be answered and start asking to be held. Not tightly, not with effort, but loosely, the way you hold a warm mug late at night, aware of it without needing to examine it. The question doesn't disappear, it simply changes its posture. It sits with you, rather than in front of you. This is usually the moment when thinking softens. You might notice it now, the way attention feels different than it did earlier. Less sharp, less driven. The mind still moves, but it does not rush. Thoughts arrive, linger briefly, and drift on without needing to be followed. There is no task to complete, no argument to win, no conclusion to reach before rest is allowed. That is not a failure of curiosity. It is a different phase of it. Most of the time, humans approach questions as problems. Something to solve, something to clarify, something to pin down so it stops moving. That approach has its place. It builds tools, systems, explanations. But there are questions that resist this treatment, not because they are unsolvable, but because solving them would flatten what makes them meaningful. This question is one of those. What if humans are the experiment? Not as a claim, not as a theory to defend, just as a lens, something to look through rather than something to prove. When held this way, it does not demand belief. It does not require action. It simply reframes experience slightly, like shifting your head on the pillow and noticing the room from a new angle. From inside that lens, life does not suddenly change. You still breathe. You still get tired. You still worry about ordinary things. You still care about people. You still make choices without knowing their full consequences. Nothing dramatic happens, and that is the point. If there were something to discover that would override experience, it would already have done so. It would interrupt. It would insist. It would not allow itself to be ignored. But experience continues uninterrupted even as the question lingers. That continuity tells you something important. Whatever this is, it does not require resolution to function. Sleep works this way too. You do not fall asleep by figuring out the day. You fall asleep by letting it stop asking for attention. The body knows what to do long before the mind agrees to step back. You can feel that process beginning when thoughts lose their urgency, when sentences in your mind trail off without needing to finish, when the need to connect ideas weakens and simple awareness becomes enough. The question can stay. It does not need to leave for rest to arrive. In fact, questions often make better companions for sleep than answers. Answers close doors. Questions leave them open. Open doors allow air to move through, allow the mind to wander without getting stuck. There is something deeply human about falling asleep while holding a question that does not need to be resolved. Children do this naturally. They ask why, are given partial answers, and drift off before the explanation is complete. The question stays with them, quietly, shaping curiosity without demanding immediate clarity. Adults often lose this ability. They feel pressure to finish thoughts, to resolve uncertainty, to arrive somewhere definite before letting go. But sleep does not require certainty. It requires safety. And safety does not come from answers as much as it comes from permission. Permission to not know, at least for now. If humans were the experiment, sleep would be one of its most telling features. Every day, consciousness steps back, attention narrows, control loosens. The system pauses not because it is finished, but because continuation requires rest. Nothing watches more closely during sleep. No decisions are made. No performances are given. The mind drifts through fragments, images, half-formed ideas. Memory reorganizes itself quietly. The body repairs. The nervous system recalibrates. From the inside, this feels like absence. From the outside, it is maintenance. You do not need to stay alert to be part of what is unfolding. You never did. That is worth noticing because many people carry a quiet tension, as if something important might be missed if they stop paying attention. As if vigilance itself is a responsibility. But life does not pause when you sleep. It does not require your oversight. It continues gently without consulting you. That continuation is not a threat. It is a reassurance. Whatever the larger context may be, it does not depend on your constant awareness. You are allowed to rest inside it. The question does not need guarding. It will still be there tomorrow, or next week, or years from now, if it needs to be. And if it fades, that does not mean it was answered. It simply means attention moved elsewhere, as it always does. Think about how many questions you have carried in your life that eventually softened rather than resolved. Questions about who you were supposed to be. Questions about choices you made. Questions about things that ended without explanation. They did not vanish because they were solved. They changed because you changed. This question can do the same. If humans are the experiment, then wondering about it is not a test you pass or fail. It is just another behavior, another response, one among many. Some people will think about it deeply. Others will never encounter it. Most will drift in and out of it without noticing. That distribution does not need correcting. Nothing about this idea requires uniform awareness. In fact, uniform awareness would be unnatural. Diversity of attention is part of how the system breathes. As you lie here now, or sit quietly, or let the room darken around you, there is no expectation that you carry the entire thought with you. You can let parts of it go. You can let sentences dissolve. You can allow the edges to blur. The mind does this naturally when it is tired enough. You might notice the body more clearly now. The weight of gravity, the rhythm of breath, the way muscles release when they are no longer being held in readiness. These sensations do not need interpretation. They do not point toward conclusions. They simply happen. Experience, again, without explanation. That may be the most consistent thread running through everything considered here. Experience does not wait for understanding. It does not pause until meaning is assigned. It unfolds moment by moment, regardless of whether it is framed as an experiment, a coincidence, a story, or nothing at all. You are inside it whether you think about it or not, and inside it you rest. There is no final thought required before sleep arrives. No summary, no closing argument. Even this narration does not need to reach a point. It can taper, it can loosen, it can leave space, because space is what sleep needs most. If your mind wanders back to the question as you drift, that is fine. Let it float without gripping it. You do not need to chase it. You do not need to finish it. You can simply notice it passing through, like a cloud that does not need naming. And if the question slips away entirely, that is also fine. It is not fragile. It does not depend on attention to exist. What remains is the quiet fact of being here, now, breathing, tired in a way that does not need fixing. Whatever this is, whatever context holds it, it allows for rest. It does not demand vigilance. It does not require proof. You are not missing anything by letting go. So if sleep is close, you can allow it. Let thoughts thin out. Let awareness narrow to simple sensations. Let the question remain unanswered, not as a problem, but as a presence that no longer asks for effort. And if sleep takes you before the thought finishes forming, that is not interruption. That is continuation. Because nothing about this needs to conclude for rest to begin.